There is a stretch of coastline in the south of France where the sea runs so blue it looks painted, where fishing villages climb the hillsides in pale stone, and the air in summer carries lavender and salt together, where, on an ordinary August morning, you might sit with coffee and watch the water and feel that nothing in the world could disturb a place this quiet. On the 15th of August, 1944, that quiet ended in fire. More than 1,000 Allied ships moved through the darkness of the Mediterranean before dawn that day. Hundreds of thousands of men, American, French, British, Canadian, pressed close to the railings of their transports or lay awake in their bunks below decks, listening to the engines, listening to the sea, thinking about the shore they could not yet see. Overhead, aircraft droned in tight formations toward a coastline bristling with German guns. And in the hills above the beaches, paratroopers were already on the ground, dropped in the moonless dark hours before the fleet arrived, fighting in fields and orchards, cutting roads, holding bridges, doing the invisible work of preventing German reinforcements from reaching the water's edge in time. The operation was called Dragoon, and if you have never heard of it, if this is the first time that name has crossed your awareness, you are not alone. Dragoon was the second great Allied invasion of France in the summer of 1944. It was planned over months of argument and negotiation between commanders who did not always agree, assembled across 3 continents and multiple navies, launched from ports in North Africa and Italy and the island of Corsica, and executed against fortified defences on one of the most recognizable coastlines in the world. It liberated Marseille and Toulon within weeks. It drove German armies north up the Rhône Valley in a retreat that turned into a rout. It closed, eventually, from the south, the same enormous trap that Eisenhower's forces were closing from the west. And on the 12th of September, 1944, soldiers who had landed on southern beaches met soldiers who had crossed from Normandy, near Dijon, and the encirclement of German forces in France was complete. All of that happened, and yet, for most people who were not there, Dragoon remains the other invasion, the forgotten one, the one that gets a paragraph in the larger story while Normandy receives the chapters. That imbalance is what this documentary is here to correct. Tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon, whenever you have found your way here and made yourself comfortable, we are going to follow the complete story of Operation Dragoon, from its earliest conception to its final, decisive conclusion. We will sit with the planners in their argument-filled conference rooms as they debate whether this operation should even exist. We will stand on the decks of ships moving through Mediterranean darkness. We will move through the smoke of naval bombardment, across beaches under fire, through the narrow streets of towns that had lived under occupation for 4 years and were about to be free. We will follow the paratroopers scattered by night winds across the French countryside. We will watch German commanders try to make sense of a situation that was unraveling faster than any orders from Berlin could address. We will walk into liberated cities with the men and women who had waited years for that moment. And we will ask, at the end of all of it, the question that military historians still argue over: was Dragoon necessary? Was it a strategic masterstroke? Or was it, as some British commanders furiously believed at the time, a costly diversion of resources from more important fronts? We will look at the evidence carefully, without sentimentality, and let the facts make the case. This is a story about strategy and sacrifice, about the politics of coalition warfare, where American generals and British generals and Free French commanders all brought their own agendas to the same table, about the extraordinary logistical achievement of putting hundreds of thousands of men ashore on a defended coastline and supplying them across an ocean, about the French citizens who risked everything as resistance fighters in the hills above the beaches, and about the soldiers, many of them very young, who crossed the water toward a shore they had never seen. It is also, in part, a story about memory, about why some operations become the images we carry of a war, and why others, equally significant, equally costly, equally brave, slip quietly to the margins. Dragoon did not have the same photographic record that Normandy did. Its timing, 2 months after the 6th of June 1944, meant it arrived into a world that had already received its defining image of the Allied war in Europe. And so it was filed away, acknowledged, assigned its proper coordinates in the official histories, and then largely left there. But the men who waded ashore on those southern beaches did not file it away. The French families who watched Allied columns roll through their villages did not file it away. The German soldiers who spent the rest of the war in prisoner-of-war camps because Dragoon cut off their line of retreat, they surely did not file it away. For all of them, it was the war itself, entire and overwhelming, as real and as definitive as anything that happened anywhere else on the European continent that year. So if you are settling in now, if you have found a comfortable position, if the screen is soft and the room is quiet, and you are ready to let the night pass slowly, we are glad you are here. This is the kind of story that rewards patience. It builds from the conference rooms where the arguments happened to the beaches where the consequences of those arguments were paid for, in full, by ordinary people asked to do extraordinary things. There are 18 chapters ahead of us. We will move through all of them, together, at a pace that is meant to be absorbed rather than rushed. This is not a story to skim. It is a story to inhabit, to let settle into you slowly, the way long histories do when you give them room. If this is your first time watching this channel, welcome. We make documentaries like this one, long, careful, complete, because some stories are too important to compress and too rich to summarize. If you have been here before, you already know what to expect, and we are grateful to have you back. Find your blanket, adjust the pillow, let the room go a little darker if you can. The Mediterranean is waiting, the ships are moving. The 15th of August 1944 is about to begin. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a turning point that every soldier, every planner, and every frightened civilian could feel in the air. Normandy had changed everything. On the 6th of June, Allied armies had crashed onto the beaches of northern France and torn open the western wall of Hitler's empire. The cost had been staggering, thousands dead in a single morning. But the strategic prize was real, and it was growing. Within weeks, armored columns were pushing through the French countryside, liberating towns and villages that had lived under occupation for 4 long years. The Germans were bleeding, their reserves were stretched, and somewhere in the corridors of Allied planning rooms, a question was already forming. Was there a way to hit them again, from the south, before they could recover? The answer, forged through months of argument and compromise, would eventually become one of the largest amphibious operations of the entire war. It would be called Operation Dragoon. To understand why a second invasion of France was even considered, you have to understand the geography of power in 1944. Southern France was not simply a scenic stretch of coastline, it was a corridor. The Rhône Valley ran like a spine through the interior of the country, connecting the Mediterranean coast to the heart of German-occupied Europe. Whoever controlled that valley controlled the movement of troops, supplies, and reinforcements across a vast stretch of southern territory. German forces in that region were not merely occupiers. They were a strategic reserve, a force that could be redirected north to blunt any Allied advance from Normandy if the pressure from the south was never applied. Allied planners understood this calculus with cold clarity. A second landing in the south would not just liberate more French territory, it would force the German High Command to fight on two axes simultaneously, stretching their already thinning resources to a breaking point they could not sustain. The idea itself was not new. As early as the late months of 1943, senior Allied commanders had begun discussing the possibility of a Mediterranean landing in southern France as a complement to whatever operation would eventually hit the northern coast. It traveled under different names, different code words, through different planning committees before it settled into the shape it would finally take. At every stage, the concept made a certain ruthless military logic. The ports of Marseille and Toulon sat on the southern coast like two enormous prizes, deep water facilities capable of receiving the volume of supplies that any large Allied army needed to sustain itself across hundreds of kilometers of contested ground. Normandy's ports were already under immense pressure. The Allies were feeding a massive and hungry war machine through facilities that had never been designed for such volume. Cracking open Marseille and Toulon would change the arithmetic of Allied logistics in a fundamental way. This was not an operation of ambition for its own sake. It was an operation of necessity. But necessity and consensus are not the same thing, and the planning for what would become Operation Dragoon was accompanied from the very beginning by a sustained and sometimes bitter disagreement among the men who commanded the Allied cause. At the center of that disagreement stood two figures whose relationship combined genuine mutual respect with an equally genuine difference in strategic vision. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, pushed for the southern France landing as a critical component of his broad front strategy. His counterpart on the British side, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, resisted with a tenacity that sometimes bordered on fury. Churchill's objections were not trivial. He believed that Allied resources in the Mediterranean were better directed toward an advance through Italy and into the Balkans, a thrust that in his calculation would reach Central Europe before the Soviet Union could establish a permanent presence there. The argument was as much political as it was military, and it would simmer for months before the American position finally prevailed. The American insistence on the southern France operation rested on several pillars, each one reinforcing the others. First was the matter of French honor and French resources. General Charles de Gaulle and the Free French leadership had been promised a role in the liberation of their own country that went beyond a symbolic gesture. France possessed substantial military forces by this stage of the war, trained, equipped, and burning with the desire to take back their homeland. An invasion of southern France would put those forces at the center of the action, and it would deliver the symbolic weight of French soldiers liberating French soil. Second was the sheer arithmetic of German strength. Every division tied down in southern France was a division that could not reinforce the Normandy front. Eisenhower and his staff ran those numbers repeatedly, and the conclusion was always the same. Pressure from the south was not a luxury. It was part of the equation. Third, and perhaps most practically, was the port capacity question, which kept returning to every planning conversation like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Churchill pushed back hard, and his objections found some support among British commanders who shared his instinct for the indirect approach. The argument for a Balkan thrust had a seductive strategic logic to it, and the Prime Minister was not wrong to worry about Soviet power expanding westward as German resistance crumbled. But Eisenhower held firm, backed by the weight of American military and industrial power that by 1944 had become the dominant force within the Allied coalition. The relationship between the two men never broke under the strain, But the disagreement over southern France was one of the sharpest of the entire war. Churchill would later write of the operation with barely concealed frustration, describing it as a diversion of resources that he believed served no purpose that could not have been achieved more elegantly elsewhere. History, in the end, would offer a different judgment. While the argument ran its course at the highest levels, the men responsible for actually planning and executing the invasion got to work. General Alexander Patch, commanding the American 7th Army, became the operational architect of what would eventually be named Operation Dragoon. Patch was not a figure who sought the limelight, but within military circles he was understood to be exactly the kind of officer a complex combined operation required: methodical, precise, and capable of managing the friction between national contingents with a steady hand. The forces assembling under his command would eventually include not only American divisions, but also the French Army B, under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, a force that represented both military capability and enormous emotional weight. Planning sessions stretched across months, involving naval commanders, airborne planners, intelligence officers, and logistical specialists who had to coordinate movements across 3 continents. The planning process was complicated by the sheer number of variables that any amphibious operation carries within it: weather, tides, coastal defenses, inland terrain, the availability of landing craft, which were simultaneously in demand for operations in the Pacific, in Normandy, and potentially in Italy. Decisions made in one theatre rippled into another, and the men managing those ripples had to keep multiple competing priorities in balance without letting any one of them tip into crisis. The selection of the actual landing beaches, a stretch of the Côte d'Azur between Toulon and Cannes, was not made quickly or easily. Every candidate beach was assessed for gradient, for German fortification, for proximity to road networks, for the depth of water that landing craft required to approach without grounding. The eventual choice reflected a careful balance between military utility and the realistic limits of what Allied forces could achieve against prepared defenses. Intelligence became the foundation on which everything else was built. Allied planners needed to know not just where the Germans had placed their guns and their troops, but how confident those defenders were, how well supplied, how connected to the broader German command structure. The picture that emerged from aerial reconnaissance, from agent reports, and from signals intelligence painted a picture of a garrison that was stretched and in some places complacent, a garrison that had convinced itself, at least in part, that the Allies would not risk a second major amphibious operation so soon after Normandy. That complacency, if it could be preserved and exploited, was itself a weapon. It shaped how the Allies designed their deception campaign, how they managed their own radio traffic, and how they timed the movements of their enormous fleet. Every piece of the operation was designed to ensure that when the blow finally fell, it would fall before the enemy had recovered his balance. By the spring of 1944, the broad outline of the operation was taking shape, even as the argument at the political level had not yet fully resolved. American planners proceeded with a confidence that reflected their conviction that the operation would ultimately be approved, a confidence that proved justified when the final authorization came through. The men who would carry out the invasion began their training. Sailors practiced beach approaches in waters that approximated the conditions they would face. Infantrymen rehearsed the chaos of getting from a landing craft onto a defended shore. Paratroopers packed their equipment and studied maps of French terrain they had not yet seen in person. Somewhere in that enormous machinery of preparation, individual human beings were making peace with the possibility that they would not survive what was coming. That is always the quiet truth underneath the logistics and the strategic arguments. Every plan, however elegant, is eventually carried by men who are not sure they will come home. There was also the question of timing, which linked Operation Dragoon inextricably to the fate of the Normandy campaign. The southern landing could not be launched too soon, the resources were not available, and the deception plan required time to mature. But it could not be delayed too long either, because every week that passed allowed German commanders in the south to read Allied intentions more clearly and to reinforce their positions accordingly. The window that planners eventually settled on, the middle weeks of August 1944, reflected a careful reading of how long German attention could be held on Normandy, while a second blow was being prepared in the south. It was a calculation that could not be made with certainty. War rarely permits certainty, but the men making those decisions had access to extraordinary intelligence, hard-won experience, and the accumulated lessons of every previous amphibious operation the Allies had attempted. They believed they had found the moment. They planned accordingly. What emerged from those months of argument, planning, and preparation was an operation of considerable ambition and genuine military necessity. An operation that would put hundreds of thousands of men on the shores of southern France with orders to drive northward and close a trap around the German forces that stood between the Allies and the end of the war. The Mediterranean gamble, as some would later call it, was not a gamble born of recklessness. It was a calculated act, backed by strategic logic, political will, and the accumulated strength of a coalition that had grown more powerful with every month that the war continued. The debates that had surrounded it would not disappear overnight. Churchill's reservations would resurface in memoirs and diplomatic correspondence long after the guns fell silent. But in the summer of 1944, the decision had been made. The ships were being loaded, the paratroopers were checking their equipment, and along the sun-warmed shores of the French Riviera, the Germans were waiting, some of them confident, some of them anxious, and very few of them prepared for what was coming. Along the sun-bleached shores of southern France, where pale limestone cliffs dropped into water the color of polished turquoise, a different kind of architecture had taken root. The grand hotels of Cannes sat behind coils of barbed wire. The promenades of Nice were interrupted by concrete emplacements. The old harbour at Toulon, once a place of fishermen and merchant vessels, had become a naval fortress ringed with steel and gun positions. By the summer of 1944, the French Riviera wore its occupation the way a man wears a wound, visibly, permanently, and with a kind of dull fury that had settled into the stone itself. 4 years of German control had transformed one of the most beautiful coastlines in Europe into a defensive wall, and the men who built it believed, with a conviction bordering on certainty, that it would never truly be tested. The broader defensive structure along this stretch of the Mediterranean was part of a concept that had evolved under pressure. Following the Allied landings in North Africa in 1942 and Sicily in 1943, German High Command understood that the Mediterranean was not a quiet flank. Orders came down to fortify the southern coast of France against the possibility of amphibious assault. Work gangs, many of them forced labourers drawn from occupied territories, poured concrete into the hillsides above beaches. Gun emplacements were carved into coastal rock. Artillery batteries were positioned to command the approaches from the sea, their barrels angled out over the blue water like the fingers of a clenched fist. The labour was immense, the human cost largely invisible to the commanders who reviewed the finished positions on maps. The town of Toulon was the most heavily defended point along the entire southern coastline, and for good reason. As France's principal Mediterranean naval base, Toulon had both strategic value and symbolic weight. Its harbour was deep enough for capital ships. Its position gave whoever held it command over a critical stretch of sea lane running between Italy and Spain. The Germans had fortified its perimeter with layers of gun batteries, anti-tank obstacles, and infantry positions that interlocked to cover each other's approaches. Any force trying to take Toulon from the sea or from the landward side would face a grinding urban engagement that German planners expected would cost the Allies dearly. The garrison there was not elite. It was composed largely of units considered reliable for static defense, older men and soldiers deemed unfit for the mobile warfare of the Eastern Front. But the fortifications themselves were meant to compensate for whatever the garrison lacked in offensive spirit. Cannes and Nice presented a different character. These towns were prized for their position rather than any single military installation, and the defences there were woven into the civilian fabric of occupation in ways that made them harder to read from the outside. Villas became command posts. Hotels became billets for officers and headquarters staff. Roads leading inland were mined and booby-trapped at intervals, their verges studded with obstacles designed to slow any armoured advance from the beaches. The beaches themselves, golden, wide, and gently sloping in a way that any naval planner would recognize as inviting landing zones, had been strewn with mines below the waterline and obstructions above it. Wooden stakes, metal hedgehogs, and wire entanglements broke the clean geometry of the shoreline. Yet even with all of this, the German defensive effort along these stretches was spread thin, stretched across too many kilometers to be genuinely deep anywhere. The commander responsible for defending Army Group G in southern France was a man who had studied his maps carefully and drawn conclusions that the evidence only partially supported. He assessed the Allied strategic posture and concluded that the primary threat remained in northern France, where the fighting following the Normandy landings in June had already committed enormous German resources. From his perspective, a second amphibious landing in the south was theoretically possible but operationally secondary. A diversion, perhaps, or a feint designed to pull resources away from the real battles further north. This assessment was not unreasonable given the information available to him, but it carried within it a fundamental error. He underestimated both Allied capacity and Allied intention. The Allies, he believed, were stretched. In reality, they were building. German intelligence along the southern coast was impaired in ways that compounded this misjudgment. The French resistance, deeply embedded in the towns and villages of Provence, had become skilled at feeding false information into German networks while withholding accurate intelligence about Allied preparations. Coastal observation posts reported ship movements in the western Mediterranean, but the reports were incomplete, filtered through chains of communication that introduced delays and distortions. The Luftwaffe, which might have provided aerial reconnaissance to clarify the picture, was operating at a fraction of its earlier strength. Allied fighter cover over the western Mediterranean had grown formidable enough to make German reconnaissance flights genuinely hazardous. By the late summer of 1944, German commanders in the south were making critical decisions based on fragmentary information and a strategic assumption that had not been rigorously tested. Supply lines running through southern France carried the weight of the entire German position in the theatre. The Rhône Valley, running north from the Mediterranean coast toward Lyon and beyond, was the primary artery through which men, ammunition, fuel, and food moved to sustain German forces across a vast stretch of occupied territory. Road and rail networks branching from Marseille and Toulon fed into this larger system, and the health of those networks was the health of the German defensive position. Allied strategic bombing had already begun to degrade rail infrastructure across France by the summer of 1944, striking bridges, marshalling yards, and engine depots in an effort to strangle German logistics before any ground campaign began. The Germans were aware of this campaign and struggled to repair what was destroyed faster than it could be struck again. Their margin for error was narrowing. Despite these pressures, the atmosphere at certain levels of German command in southern France carried a quality of misplaced ease that would later seem astonishing. Officers quartered in the confiscated villas of the Riviera enjoyed a standard of comfort that stood in sharp contrast to the conditions endured on other fronts. The landscape was temperate, the requisitioned food supplies were adequate, and the resistance, though a persistent irritant, had not yet reached the pitch of open insurrection that would come in August. Some officers genuinely believed that their posting to southern France was a reward, a quiet assignment compared to the carnage of the Eastern Front or the grinding attrition in Normandy. This psychological comfort was a liability dressed as a privilege. The German assessment of Allied amphibious capacity was shaped in part by memory and in part by analysis. The major Allied landings of the previous 2 years, in North Africa, Sicily, and at Anzio, had all demonstrated that amphibious operations were costly, slow to consolidate, and vulnerable in their early hours. German planners believed that a counterstrike delivered quickly against any landing in southern France could replicate the near disaster inflicted on the Allies at Anzio, where months of fighting had been required to break out of a beachhead that should have fallen in days. This historical comparison carried a seductive logic, but it ignored the degree to which the Allies had refined their amphibious techniques, their fire support coordination, and their logistical planning between Anzio and the summer of 1944. The Allies who would come ashore in August were not the same Allies who had stumbled at Anzio. Inland from the coast, the terrain of Provence presented a different set of challenges and opportunities. The hills and gorges running behind the beaches would funnel any advancing force into predictable routes, passes through the Massif des Maures, river crossings at established fords, road junctions in small towns whose names would soon appear on Allied operational maps. German engineers had identified these choke points and prepared demolitions, roadblocks, and defensive positions designed to slow an advance inland to a crawl. The assumption behind these preparations was that any Allied landing force would be contained near the beaches long enough for German reserves to be brought forward from the interior. That assumption required those reserves to be mobile, available, and not committed elsewhere. By August of 1944, all 3 of those conditions were under strain. The French population of the Riviera and Provence lived inside this military machine, with a mixture of enforced compliance and silent resistance. For 4 years, they had watched German soldiers occupy their streets, requisition their property, and enforce curfews and restrictions that reduced daily life to a careful negotiation between survival and dignity. By the summer of 1944, with Allied armies fighting in Normandy, and the BBC broadcasting coded messages that the resistance understood as signals of impending action, the mood among ordinary French civilians had shifted. The waiting, which had felt endless, was beginning to feel finite. People whispered. Radios were hidden behind walls and listened to in the dark. German patrols noticed a change in the quality of civilian silence, a tension beneath the compliance that the most perceptive officers recognized as anticipation rather than submission. What the defenders of the French Riviera could not see from their reinforced positions, their beach obstacles, their carefully prepared fields of fire, was the size and sophistication of the force being assembled against them across the water. They could observe fragments, the increased air activity over the western Mediterranean, the occasional contact report from a coastal patrol, the general knowledge that Allied strength in the theatre had grown. But fragments are not a picture, and a picture composed under the influence of a fixed assumption is not an accurate one. The Germans in southern France had built genuine strength into their positions. They had poured labour, concrete, and confidence into a defensive line that they believed would hold against anything the Allies might attempt. They were about to discover that what they believed and what was true were two entirely different things. What made Operation Dragoon unlike almost any other operation of the Second World War was not merely its scale or the audacity of its conception, but the sheer breadth of the alliance it represented. Men who had grown up speaking different languages, saluting different flags, and carrying the weight of very different national histories, were now asked to move as a single coordinated force against a common enemy. From the dockyards of Naples to the staging camps of Corsica, from the briefing rooms of Algiers to the crowded troop ships rolling gently on the late summer Mediterranean, soldiers of a dozen nations were preparing to do the same thing at the same moment: cross a defended shore and take it back from those who had stolen it. That coalition had been forged not through friendship alone, but through the hard labor of diplomacy, argument, and compromise across months of difficult planning. It was a living, breathing organism made of competing ambitions and genuine shared purpose, and at its heart stood an army that was itself a kind of nation, General Alexander Patch's American 7th Army, the engine around which everything else was built. Patch himself was a man who rarely drew attention to himself, which in the culture of Allied high command made him something of an outlier. He was methodical, quietly confident, and possessed of a temperament that allowed him to absorb pressure without broadcasting it. He had commanded in the Pacific before being transferred to the Mediterranean theatre, and that experience gave him an understanding of amphibious complexity that proved invaluable when the planning for Dragoon moved into its most demanding phase. His 7th Army was the institutional backbone of the operation, responsible not only for the American divisions that would lead the assault, but for the coordination and sequencing of every national contingent that fought beneath the broader Allied banner. He managed that responsibility without the theatrical flourishes of some of his contemporaries, and the troops who served under him tended to trust him for precisely that reason. The American forces within Patch's command were the largest single component of the invasion force, and they bore the weight of the initial beach assault on the central landing zones between the towns of Cavalaire-sur-Mer and Aguet. 3 American infantry divisions formed the tip of the spear, trained extensively for amphibious operations, and equipped with the full range of landing craft, armoured support, and artillery that Allied industrial production had made available in enormous quantity by the summer of 1944. These were not green troops thrown into the water hoping for the best. They were veterans and well-trained formations who had spent months rehearsing every phase of what was about to happen. Men who understood their objectives to a level of precision that earlier invasions had often lacked. Behind them came wave after wave of support: engineers, medical units, signals detachments, and the logistical machinery that would turn a beachhead into a functioning military base within days of the first landings. But to describe Operation Dragoon as an American operation would be to tell only a fraction of its story. The Free French forces under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny represented something far more than a military contribution. For de Lattre and for the men who served under him, this was not simply another campaign in a long war. It was a return. France had fallen in 1940, its army broken and its institutions compromised. And for the French soldiers who had continued the fight through North Africa, through Italy, and through years of exile and resistance, the prospect of landing on French soil carried a weight that no order of battle or operational plan could fully capture. De Lattre's Army B, as it was formally designated at that stage, comprised hundreds of thousands of men drawn from across the French Empire and the Free French movement, soldiers from North Africa, from West Africa, from metropolitan France itself, united by the common purpose of liberating their country from an occupation that had humiliated a proud nation for 4 consecutive years. The Free French contribution extended well beyond sentiment. De Lattre's forces were assigned the critical task of taking the major port cities of Toulon and Marseille, and the urgency of that mission was fundamentally strategic rather than ceremonial. Allied planners understood with stark clarity that without functioning deep-water ports, the invasion force would eventually outrun its supply lines. The beaches of the Riviera could sustain a force for days, perhaps weeks, but not for the months of sustained offensive operations that the broader campaign required. Toulon and Marseille were the keys to southern France's logistical future, and placing French troops at the forefront of their liberation served both a practical and a political purpose that Allied command was shrewd enough to recognize. The soldiers who took those cities would be fighting for their own country's restoration, and that fact alone gave them a motivation that no general's order could manufacture. British forces, while operating under American overall command within the Dragoon framework, contributed with characteristic professionalism and in ways that shaped the operation's texture at every level. British naval and air elements were deeply embedded in the support structure for the landings, and British special forces and commando units operated in the coastal and inland zones in the days immediately preceding and following the main assault. The Special Service Brigade, which included British commandos, landed on the flanks to secure positions that protected the main American assault from interference on either side. Their tasks were precisely the sort of difficult, irregular fighting that commando training had prepared them for, holding ground in terrain that regular infantry might struggle with, disrupting German communications, and blocking routes that retreating or reinforcing enemy forces might otherwise use. Canadian involvement in Dragoon is a chapter that history has sometimes glossed over too quickly, but its contribution to the broader Allied structure of the operation was real and meaningful. Canadian naval forces participated in the enormous flotilla that assembled for the invasion, and Canadian personnel were embedded across a range of supporting roles that kept the machinery of the assault functioning. The pattern of Canadian participation reflected the broader reality of how multinational operations actually work at the level below the headlines. Not always as distinct national formations charging a beach under their own flag, but as specialists, technicians, navigators, and staff officers woven through the fabric of an integrated command structure that depended on their skills. The command architecture that held all of this together was itself a remarkable feat of institutional engineering. At the apex sat the Allied leadership in the Mediterranean, but Patch's 7th Army served as the operational hub through which national contingents communicated, coordinated, and received direction. Liaison officers moved constantly between headquarters, translating not just language but military culture, the different doctrinal assumptions, the different approaches to planning and risk, the different rhythms of decision-making that national armies bring to coalition warfare. Getting an American division commander and a Free French divisional commander to operate on adjacent ground with their objectives aligned and their communications synchronized required an enormous invisible apparatus of human translation that rarely appears in the histories, but without which operations of this complexity simply fall apart. The competing national objectives that shaped Dragoon's architecture were nowhere more visible than in the French insistence on the primacy of their role in liberating French soil. Delattre was a proud and sometimes difficult man, possessed of a commanding presence and an absolute conviction that French honor was at stake in every decision made about how his troops were employed. He clashed with Allied planners on more than one occasion over questions of sequencing and priority, and those clashes sometimes generated genuine friction at the command level. But that friction was also a source of energy. Delattre pushed his forces harder and demanded faster movement because the alternative, watching any objective of French national significance fall to non-French troops, was simply unacceptable to him. Allied commanders learned to work with that pressure rather than against it, and the result was a French army that moved with a speed and aggression that surprised even those who had planned its role. Beneath the formal command structures, the human texture of Allied cooperation was something far less tidy and far more interesting than any organizational chart could suggest. American sergeants and French lieutenants worked out field problems with hand gestures and improvised pigeon communication in the staging camps of Corsica. British commando officers briefed alongside American rangers in rooms where maps covered every wall and the language shifted halfway through a sentence. North African soldiers who had crossed the Sahara and fought at Monte Cassino now prepared to land on a coast whose beauty they had been shown only in aerial photographs and intelligence reports. The operation was not a seamless machine. It was a collaboration between human beings with different histories, different fears, and different definitions of what they were fighting for, held together by something more durable than any single shared ideology, a shared enemy, and a shared refusal to accept his continued existence on French soil. Understanding why that collaboration worked requires acknowledging what might have broken it. Logistics were a perpetual source of tension, as every national contingent believed its requirements were not being met with sufficient urgency. Questions of precedence: which unit crossed a given road first, which formation received credit for a given objective, were never trivial matters in a coalition where national pride was inseparable from military performance, and the political dimension was never far from the surface. The shape of liberated France's future government was already a matter of active competition among the Allies, and the visibility of French forces in the liberation of French cities was understood by everyone in the room to have implications that extended well beyond the military campaign. Charles de Gaulle, not present in Dragoon's command structure, but present in every political calculation that surrounded it, cast a long influence over decisions that nominally concerned only operational matters. What Alexander Patch built across those months of preparation was not a perfect instrument, but a functional one, which in the conditions of coalition warfare amounts to something close to a masterpiece. He held together national contingents with very different agendas, managed the egos of commanders who were accustomed to having their authority respected absolutely, and maintained the operational coherence of a plan that would have to survive first contact with an enemy who, whatever his failings in prediction and response, was still capable of inflicting serious damage on a landing force that put a foot wrong. When the fleet finally turned its bow toward the French coast in the darkness of the 14th and 15th of August, it carried within it not just weapons and ammunition and men, but the accumulated weight of everything that had been argued over, negotiated, rehearsed, and reluctantly agreed upon across months of inter-allied labor. The coalition that Operation Dragoon represented was imperfect in the way that all human endeavors are imperfect, but it was ready. Before a single soldier set foot on a French beach, before the first naval gun was trained on a coastal fortification, the Allies fought and won a battle that most would never see. It was a battle of signals and silence, of fabricated orders and phantom fleets, of carefully staged performances designed for an audience of German intelligence officers sitting hundreds of kilometers away. Deception in warfare is as old as conflict itself, but by the summer of 1944, the Allies had elevated it into something approaching a precise and ruthless science. The lessons learned in the planning of Operation Overlord, the vast deception apparatus that had helped blind German commanders to the true landing sites in Normandy, were not forgotten as planners turned their attention south. They would be applied again, with equal care and even greater confidence, in the weeks leading up to the landings on the French Riviera. The men and women responsible for this hidden war understood something fundamental, that the time and blood spent constructing a convincing lie might save more lives than any number of artillery shells. And so, through the long hot weeks of midsummer, they set to work. The central challenge facing Allied planners was a geographical one. The French Mediterranean coastline presented several plausible invasion corridors, and German commanders knew this perfectly well. They had studied the same maps, measured the same beaches, calculated the same distances from Allied-held ports in North Africa, Corsica, and Italy. Any stretch of open shore within range of Allied air cover was theoretically vulnerable, and the Germans had done their best to fortify the most likely points. What the Allies needed was not simply to choose the right beaches. They had already done that, settling on a stretch of coastline between Toulon and Cannes, but to ensure the Germans did not reinforce those particular beaches before the assault went in. The only way to achieve that was to make the enemy look elsewhere, and to keep him looking in the wrong direction for long enough to matter. Every hour that German reserves remained misallocated was an hour the invasion force could use to consolidate and push inland. The deception effort drew heavily on techniques that had already proved their worth in earlier campaigns. False radio traffic was among the most powerful tools available. Specially trained signals units broadcast carefully scripted wireless communications, the electronic chatter of formations that did not exist, headquarters that had no buildings, and supply convoys that carried nothing but fiction. German intercept stations, diligently recording Allied radio traffic as they had been trained to do, picked up these transmissions and passed them to intelligence analysts. The picture that emerged from those intercepts was one of substantial Allied interest in the Italian coastline, particularly the area around Genoa. On paper, the signals suggested that a significant force was being assembled and prepared for an amphibious operation against the northwestern coast of Italy, a thrust that would threaten German supply lines and the rear of their formations still fighting in the Italian peninsula. It was a credible threat, and German analysts who studied it saw no obvious reason to dismiss it. Alongside the radio deception, physical staging was carefully managed to reinforce the illusion. Genuine assault preparations, the loading of ships, the movement of troops, the accumulation of landing craft, were conducted in ways that could be observed from a distance and interpreted as pointing toward Italy. Harbours on the western coast of Italy and along the approaches that suggested a northern target saw heightened activity that was both real and deliberately performative. The Allies understood that German aerial reconnaissance, though degraded by Allied air superiority, could still occasionally produce useful photographs. What those photographs needed to show was purposeful, convincing activity that supported the false narrative being broadcast over the airwaves. The combination of electronic and visual deception was designed to create a coherent, mutually reinforcing picture, the kind of picture that builds confidence in an analyst rather than raising suspicion. There was also the matter of keeping the true preparations invisible, or at least ambiguous. The genuine assembly of the invasion fleet was an enormous undertaking that involved hundreds of ships moving through waters watched by German submarines, reconnaissance aircraft, and a network of agents. Complete concealment was never realistic. What the Allies aimed for instead was plausible deniability, ensuring that the movements visible to German observers could be explained away as logistical routine, as supply runs to Corsica, as the normal churning of a busy Mediterranean theatre. Strict communications discipline was enforced across the entire invasion force. Units preparing for Dragoon were given cover stories, restricted in their correspondence, and in some cases deliberately misinformed about their own destination until the very last possible moment, not from distrust of the soldiers, but to ensure that no carelessly spoken word could unravel months of careful work. The intelligence dimension of the deception extended beyond Allied actions. French resistance networks in southern France had been painstakingly cultivated over years, and they contributed actively to the campaign of misdirection. Operatives passed information to German intelligence, information that was true enough to be credible, but shaped to support the false picture being constructed. Double agents operating within German-controlled networks fed their handlers accounts that confirmed the Italian threat, described phantom troop concentrations, and reported on fictitious supply movements. The management of this human intelligence network required extraordinary patience and precision. A single inconsistency, a single source whose credibility collapsed at the wrong moment, could potentially unravel the entire edifice. The officers responsible for this work carried that knowledge with them through every meeting and every carefully worded report. The psychological dimension was equally deliberate. German commanders in southern France were already operating under significant stress by the summer of 1944. The disaster in Normandy had consumed men, equipment, and prestige. The armies defending France were being stretched in ways that no doctrine had anticipated. Against this backdrop, the Allied deception campaign was designed not merely to misdirect German attention, but to exploit existing anxieties. If a German commander was already worried about his flanks, already conscious that he lacked the reserves to respond decisively to a major landing anywhere along his coast, then an ambiguous intelligence picture became all the more paralyzing. Uncertainty, in sufficient quantities, produces hesitation, and hesitation, in the hours following an amphibious landing, can determine whether a defender holds his ground or loses it entirely. German commanders did, in fact, have a reasonable general awareness that an invasion somewhere in the Mediterranean was coming. They had watched the pattern of Allied air operations intensifying over southern France. They had noted the rising tempo of activity in ports across the central Mediterranean. Several senior officers believed a landing on or near the Riviera coast was entirely plausible, and had said so in their assessments. The problem was not a complete failure of intuition, but rather a failure to act decisively on that intuition in the face of contradictory intelligence. The deception effort did not need to make German commanders believe an invasion was impossible. It simply needed to introduce enough doubt, enough competing possibilities, to prevent them from making the correct preparations in time. That narrower objective was well within reach, and the deception planners understood exactly how slim the margin they needed to create truly was. In the final weeks before the 15th of August, the pace of the deception campaign accelerated alongside the pace of genuine preparation. Signals traffic increased in volume and complexity, the phantom formations being projected toward the Italian coast received notional reinforcements. Reports fed through resistance channels described command meetings, loading schedules, and assault rehearsals that existed only in the imaginations of the officers who had fabricated them. At sea, small naval units conducted conspicuous patrols along the Italian approaches, their presence carefully calibrated to suggest reconnaissance rather than routine operation. Every element of the campaign was timed and coordinated, reviewed by officers who understood both the intelligence and operational dimensions of what they were attempting. It was, in every meaningful sense, a second plan running parallel to the real one, and it had to be executed with the same rigor. One of the most quietly effective aspects of the deception was its management of timing. The Allies knew that even a perfectly constructed false picture would eventually begin to dissolve under the weight of observable reality as the true invasion fleet moved into position. The question was how long the deception needed to hold. It did not need to last forever. It did not even need to last for weeks after the landings. What it needed to do was hold long enough for German commanders to delay committing their mobile reserves, to keep reinforcements traveling toward the wrong place or standing idle waiting for clarification that never came. Even a delay of 24 to 48 hours in the movement of German armored or mechanized reserves could translate directly into kilometers of uncontested Allied advance and thousands of lives preserved. The deception was not designed as a masterpiece to be admired indefinitely. It was designed as a tool with a specific, measurable purpose. When the invasion fleet finally moved on the night of the 14th into the 15th of August, the deception had done its work. German reserves were not positioned to deliver an immediate, coordinated counterattack against the landing beaches. The mobile formations that might have crashed into the Allied beachheads in those vulnerable early hours were not where they needed to be. Communications between German headquarters reflected genuine confusion about both the location and the scale of what was unfolding. Senior commanders found themselves requesting clarification from subordinates who had no clear answers, while the window for effective counteraction narrowed with every passing minute. The false picture constructed over weeks of careful effort had not survived contact with the reality of the landing itself. No deception could be expected to, but it had held long enough. It had bought exactly the time the invasion needed. What the deception campaign of Operation Dragoon ultimately demonstrated was a truth that commanders throughout history have understood, but rarely managed to implement with such discipline. The mind of the enemy is a battlefield as real as any stretch of sand or hedgerow country. The men who operated radios broadcasting signals to imaginary divisions, the officers who reviewed every detail of a fictitious operational plan, the agents who reported phantom convoys to German handlers, none of them would fire a weapon on the 15th of August. Their battle was already over, and they had won it in the darkness, in the silence between transmissions, and in the careful accumulation of convincing falsehoods. By the time the first Allied soldier felt French sand beneath his boots, the most important victory of Operation Dragoon had already been secured. The Mediterranean, in the weeks before the 15th of August 1944, was no longer a quiet sea. Across its surface, from the harbours of North Africa to the wharves of southern Italy to the rocky anchorages of Corsica, a vast and deliberate machinery of war was grinding itself into motion. Ships of every description, troop transports riding low under their human cargo, landing craft riding lighter with the menace of their purpose, cruisers and destroyers cutting clean lines through the summer swell, were converging on a body of water that had already witnessed years of savage contest. The men aboard them carried with them the weight of everything the previous years had cost. North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, the grinding advance up the Italian boot. They were not novices. They understood the sea, the beaches, the particular cruelty of an opposed landing. And yet, for all their experience, The scale of what was being assembled around them was something few had ever seen concentrated in one theatre before. The fleet gathering for Operation Dragoon numbered nearly 900 vessels in total. To put that into words, a man standing on a Corsican headland could comprehend, as far as the eye could reach, in every direction there were ships. Naples served as the great artery through which the bulk of this force had flowed. The city's harbour, battered and half-wrecked from earlier fighting, had been rebuilt by Allied engineers into a functioning port capable of pushing enormous tonnages of men and equipment into the Mediterranean pipeline. For weeks, convoys had moved through Naples with the regularity of tides, loading, cataloguing, and dispatching the components of what planners called the most carefully prepared amphibious operation in the Mediterranean theatre. Soldiers marched aboard transports in long columns, their faces carrying the particular blankness of men who have learned not to ask too many questions about where they are going until it becomes absolutely necessary to know. Tanks and artillery pieces were lifted by crane into the holds of landing ship tanks, vessels the crews called, with the dry affection of men who must live on what they are given, simply LSTs, ammunition, medical supplies, water, field rations, signals equipment, engineering materials. The inventory of modern warfare was loaded crate by crate, pallet by pallet, into ships that sat lower and lower in the harbour as the days progressed. Corsica had become the invasion's forward staging point, a great island platform thrust into the Mediterranean almost directly north of the intended landing zones. Its anchorages and improvised airstrips were alive with a controlled frenzy that resembled, to anyone watching from the hills above, a hive building toward a single purpose. From airfields cut into the island's rugged interior, American and Allied aircraft flew final reconnaissance missions over the French coast, their photographs studied and restudied by intelligence officers who were trying to locate, precisely, every gun emplacement, every minefield, every beach obstacle that German engineering had placed in the path of the assault. The aircrews knew what the photographs were for. They flew with the consciousness that their work would shape the survival odds of men they would never meet. Corsica had only been in Allied hands since the autumn of 1943, wrested from Axis control in a campaign that now seemed, in the context of what was being prepared, almost a rehearsal. Now the island crouched in the summer heat, dense with men and machines, waiting to exhale. North Africa contributed its own portion to the armada. The ports of Algeria and Tunisia, experienced hands in the business of launching Mediterranean operations, had been shipping men and material northward for weeks. French forces preparing for their own landing operations, the ones that would strike the flanks of the German defensive line and begin the liberation of their own country, were concentrated here and in the transit points further east. For the Free French soldiers and their comrades who had fought through the campaigns of the preceding years, these were not abstract preparations. They were the final steps of a road that had begun with defeat and exile and humiliation, a road that was now, after years of hard and costly walking, leading home. The emotional weight of what they were boarding these ships to accomplish was not spoken of directly, as it rarely is among soldiers, but it was present, carried invisibly in the way a man checks his equipment one more time than is strictly necessary, or stares at a coastline in the distance that he cannot yet see. The logistical challenge of coordinating this force across 3 separate staging areas, separated by hundreds of miles of open water, was, by any honest measure, staggering. Planners at the headquarters of General Alexander Patch's American 7th Army had spent months constructing the timetable that would bring all elements of the fleet together at the correct place and time. The problem was not merely numerical. though the numbers alone were daunting enough. It was a problem of sequencing. The assault craft carrying the first wave of infantry had to arrive precisely on schedule, because the naval bombardment designed to suppress German defences would be calibrated to lift at the exact moment those craft reached the beach. Too early, and the infantry would land under their own guns. Too late, and the Germans would have time to recover from the shock of the bombardment and man their positions. Every ship, every convoy, every unit of the fleet was therefore slotted into a timetable of extraordinary precision, with the understanding that the Mediterranean weather, the mechanical vulnerabilities of aging landing craft, and the simple perversity of large-scale human organization would introduce disruptions that no plan could fully anticipate. The men receiving their final briefings in the days before the departure did not, for the most part, know every detail of the plan. They knew what they needed to know: their beach, their objective, the unit to their left, the unit to their right, the recognition signals, the rally points, the medical evacuation procedures. Junior officers had been given sand tables and maps and aerial photographs, and had gathered their platoons around these objects to walk through the assault in imagination, rehearsing it until the sequence became almost automatic. Veterans of previous landings offered informal education to those who had not yet experienced the particular chaos of an opposed beach landing. Keep moving forward. Do not stop at the waterline. Do not bunch together. Find cover and use it intelligently. Stay close to your sergeant. The advice was practical, delivered without drama, and absorbed with the seriousness it deserved. These were not boys who needed courage manufactured for them. They needed technique. The naval gunners aboard the cruisers and destroyers that would form the bombardment force understood their own piece of the puzzle with equal clarity. Their targets had been assigned from the reconnaissance photographs, plotted onto fire control charts, and rehearsed in simulated exercises. The guns of the fleet that was assembling off the French coast would eventually include the firepower of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers collectively capable of delivering an enormous weight of shell onto the German coastal positions in the opening minutes of the assault. The naval commanders responsible for this bombardment carried a particular anxiety that their colleagues in the infantry perhaps did not share: the fear of short rounds, of shells falling among the assault craft or onto the beaches where their own men would be landing. The calculations required to avoid this were complex, the margins uncomfortably narrow, and the consequences of error permanent. Aboard the transports, the final days before departure were marked by the strange suspended quality that soldiers have always recognized in the hours before a major operation. Time moved at an inconsistent pace, slow in the hours of waiting and then suddenly, disconcertingly fast when there was work to do. Men wrote letters that they would hand to a ship's officer before departure, understanding that these letters would only be sent in certain circumstances. They cleaned weapons that were already clean. They played cards with a focus that had nothing to do with the game and everything to do with the need to occupy the hands while the mind processed possibilities that did not benefit from prolonged examination. The Mediterranean summer was warm, the sea in these final days relatively calm, and on clear nights, the stars above the fleet were brilliant and indifferent in the way that stars always are when men are making large decisions beneath them. The coordination between the three staging areas depended on a signals network that was itself a significant achievement of military organization. Messages moved between Naples, Corsica, and the North African ports in encrypted streams that Allied communications officers monitored around the clock, correcting, updating, and relaying the constant small adjustments that a plan of this complexity inevitably required. A landing craft flotilla that had experienced mechanical difficulties and fallen a day behind schedule. a French infantry regiment whose embarkation had been complicated by a shortage of vehicles, a resupply convoy that had encountered weather and required rerouting. Each of these small failures and corrections was absorbed into the larger plan with the characteristic bureaucratic calm of men who had built enough slack into the timetable to accommodate a certain level of friction. The plan was, its architects believed, robust. It had to be. As the final departures were ordered and the ships of the assault fleet began their careful movement toward the rendezvous points south of the French coast, the sheer scale of what had been assembled became, for those positioned to see it, genuinely arresting. Hundreds of vessels moving in coordinated columns through the summer sea, their wakes crossing and recrossing the blue water, the air above them busy with patrol aircraft, keeping watch for the submarines that never materialized in the force that planners had feared. Destroyers moved on the flanks of the convoys like dogs circling a flock, alert, purposeful, conscious of the weight of what they were protecting. The largest of the warships, the heavy cruisers and the battleships assigned to the bombardment force, moved with a ponderous authority that communicated something beyond mere size. These were instruments of a decision that had been made at the highest levels of Allied command after months of debate and argument and political maneuvering, and the decision was now irrevocable. The fleet was moving. It could not be called back. For the soldiers packed into the troop transports, many of them crowded into the lower decks, where the smell of oil and seawater and unwashed men mixed into something that became, with time, simply the smell of operations. The movement of the ship was the first concrete confirmation that all the weeks of preparation had led to this. The waiting, which is perhaps the hardest thing in warfare, was over. Whatever was ahead, the beaches, the obstacles, the German guns, the long fight up through France that no one yet knew would unfold as it did, it was approaching at the speed of a fleet moving through calm water in the last heat of a Mediterranean summer. In the hours that remained before dawn, 900 ships and the men they carried were converging on a coast that had been studied, mapped, photographed, and planned against with every tool that the most powerful military alliance in history possessed. The preparation was complete. What remained was the execution. The Mediterranean was quiet that night, not the quiet of peace, the quiet of held breath, of engines throttled low, of thousands of men pressed together in steel hulls, each one alone with his thoughts, in a way that crowds rarely permit. The great fleet had been moving since the previous day, drawing itself together from ports stretching across the sea, from Naples and Corsica, from the North African coast, from anchorages that had held these ships in patient waiting for weeks. Now all of it was in motion, converging on a strip of French coastline that most of these men had never seen, that some would never leave. The stars above the water were bright and unhurried. They had no stake in what the morning would bring. The fleet moved beneath them in long columns, blacked out, radio silent, running with the discipline of an organism that had rehearsed this moment until rehearsal felt indistinguishable from the real thing. Officers on bridge wings watched the dark shapes of neighboring vessels and said very little. There was nothing left to say. The plans had been made, the orders issued, the argument settled. All that remained was the doing of it. Below decks on the troop transports, men prepared their equipment with the particular focus that comes when preparation is the only thing standing between composure and fear. Infantrymen checked their rifles for the fourth or fifth time that night, running their fingers along metal and wood with the unconscious intimacy of craftsmen. Packs were adjusted, straps tightened, ammunition distributed. Medics laid out their supplies in careful order: bandages, morphine syrettes, wound dressings, and then laid them out again, because having something to do with your hands keeps the mind from running too far ahead. There was low conversation in the compartments, some of it practical, much of it the kind of talk men use to fill silence without quite admitting they are afraid. Someone told a joke that had already been told twice. Someone else laughed anyway. The smell below decks was the familiar compound of oil and canvas, and men living too close together, and in years to come, those who survived would say that smell alone could take them back to that night more vividly than any photograph. The men aboard these ships represented the genuinely multinational character of the operation. American soldiers who had trained in the Alabama heat and then shipped across the Atlantic, who had fought through the dust of Sicily and the mud of Italy, now sat in the dark and ate cold rations and thought about home in the way that men think about home when they are not sure they are going back to it. Free French soldiers felt something different and perhaps more urgent. They were crossing the sea not toward an abstract strategic objective, but toward their own country, their own streets, their own people. Some of them had not stood on French soil in 4 years. Some carried in their minds the specific faces of people they had left behind. That particular weight is not something training can address. It sits in a man's chest, and he carries it forward because there is no other direction available. On the warships standing offshore and threading through the columns, naval gunners prepared their pieces with methodical care. The great guns of the bombardment fleet would not fire until first light, but the work of preparation is its own form of readiness, and no gun crew wanted to be found wanting at the moment it mattered. Shells were moved from magazines to handling rooms, firing circuits tested, elevation mechanisms checked and rechecked. Petty officers moved along their gun crews, with the quiet authority of men who had done this before, and in many cases that was literally true. Some of these sailors had fired their guns in support of landings in Sicily and at Salerno and at Anzio, each one a rehearsal for something larger, a lesson accumulated at cost. They knew what the morning's bombardment would look and sound like. They knew the particular physical sensation of a large caliber gun discharging at close range, the pressure wave that travels through the deck plates and into the soles of your feet. They were ready for it. They were still glad when the night held a little longer. The airborne forces had already gone. Hours before the fleet reached its final approach positions, transport aircraft had lifted off from bases in Italy and turned north over the dark water, carrying paratroopers and the men who would follow in gliders when the first pale light made landing possible. Those men had their own version of this night. Not the slow, diesel-scented waiting of the troopships, but the particular cold and noise of an open aircraft, the roar of engines, the wind coming in through gaps in the fuselage, the way darkness outside the small windows seems absolute when you are flying over open sea with all lights doused. They sat on hard benches in full combat equipment, too laden with weapons and ammunition and rations to move comfortably, and they waited for the moment of the door. Some slept, or made the physical approximation of sleep. Others stared at nothing and let their minds go where they went. The men who had jumped before, in Sicily, in Normandy, had experience to draw on, though experience in this business is a complicated gift. It tells you what is coming, which is not always a comfort. Pilots aboard the escort carriers and at airfields on Corsica made their own preparations in the hours before midnight. Ground crews worked by shielded torches, checking engine cowlings, testing control surfaces, topping fuel tanks, arming the ordnance that would be needed at dawn. Pilots walked around their aircraft in the darkness, touching surfaces, going through checks that were partly procedural and partly something older than procedure, the superstitions of men who understood that machines could fail and that the sea is unforgiving. Fighter pilots who would fly cover over the beaches reviewed their patrol routes and their radio frequencies. Attack pilots who would work ahead of the fleet against coastal batteries ran through their target lists one more time. They were tired. The weeks of preparatory strikes and reconnaissance had been exhausting, but there is a species of alertness that supersedes tiredness when the stakes become concrete enough, and on this particular night, that alertness was general. On the French shore, German sentries looked out at a dark sea that looked exactly like a dark sea. The elaborate deception campaign that Allied planners had worked on for months had done its work through the preceding days and weeks, drawing German attention toward other possible landing points, leaving the intended coastline watched, but not reinforced with the urgency the situation would shortly demand. Some among the defenders had felt unease in recent days, a professional instinct that the patterns were not quite right, that the quiet was a particular kind of quiet. Others were persuaded by the logic that the Allies were already committed in Normandy, already stretching their resources, already opening multiple fronts. Why here? Why now? The arguments that had reassured German planners in their comfortable headquarters had filtered down to the men in the forward positions, and those men had, by and large, accepted them, because the alternative, that you are outnumbered and about to be hit, is not a thought that improves a sentry's night. Aboard the command ships, senior officers made their last reviews. Generals who had argued in conference rooms in Algiers and London and Washington over whether this operation should happen at all, who had lobbied for resources and written memoranda and pressed their cases through the long machinery of Allied deliberation, were now past deliberation. The orders were cut. The forces were committed. What could be verified had been verified. What could be planned had been planned. What remained was the portion of any military operation that no planning document can fully account for. The variable of the enemy, the variable of weather, the variable of the 10,000 small decisions that individual soldiers would make in the coming hours without reference to any headquarters. Experienced commanders understand this. They do their preparation and they trust their people, and they find, at some point in the small hours before a major assault, that there is nothing more for them to do but wait with everyone else. The fleet passed through the night in its long columns. Time moved the way it moves when you are waiting for something, not slowly exactly, but with a quality of unreality, as though the hours between midnight and dawn belonged to a different category of experience than ordinary hours. Men who had been awake since the previous morning found that sleep, which had eluded them through the nervous early evening, came on them unexpectedly in the form of the heavy, formless unconsciousness of pure exhaustion. Others who had slept earlier now found themselves completely awake, minds running through the sequences of what was to come, cataloguing what they knew and acknowledging what they did not. The coast was there, ahead of them, invisible in the darkness. French soil, French hills, French towns where people were sleeping, or not sleeping, listening to the sea and knowing or half-knowing that something had changed in the quality of the night. On the transports, a chaplain moved through the compartments in the dark, saying the words that men asked for and leaving room for the silence that men needed when words were not the right tool. He had done this before landings. He would do it again if he survived to see another. He understood, by now, that what men want in those hours is not theology but presence, the assurance that someone else is awake and watching, that they are not alone with whatever is moving through them. He moved quietly from group to group, and the men he passed nodded or spoke briefly or said nothing at all, and he respected each choice equally, because on a night like this there is no wrong way to be a human being. The first grey suggestion of light came in the east, as the fleet reached its final positions. It was not yet light enough to see the shore, not yet light enough to distinguish shapes at any distance, but it was the unmistakable announcement that the night was ending. Men who had been sitting in darkness felt it rather than saw it. A slight easing of the absolute black, a shift in the quality of the air. On the gun decks, crews took their stations. On the transports, nets were rigged over the sides, and landing craft were swung out on their davits. In the holds and compartments, men stood and hoisted their packs and checked their weapons one final time, and the collective sound of all that preparation, the clanking of equipment, the low commands of NCOs, the movement of boots on steel decking, built into something that was not quite noise and not quite silence. The coast of southern France was out there in the fading dark, roughly 40 kilometers ahead. 14 years of European war had come to this morning, and the morning was about to begin. Hastad, Chapter 7, The Bombardment. The night of the 15th of August, 1944, retreated before dawn, like a curtain drawn away from a stage. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the southern coast of France, Allied guns were already calculating trajectories. The bombardment that would announce Operation Dragoons to the world did not begin with warning shots or preliminary probes. It began with absolute conviction. At 0500 hours, the first salvos fired from naval vessels positioned offshore. The sound rolled across the Mediterranean like continuous thunder, a noise so immense that it seemed to compress the very air itself. Men on the invasion ships felt the percussion in their chests, watched the horizon light up in orange and white flashes that turned night into something approaching day. This was not the careful, measured assault of traditional artillery. This was the opening chord of an overwhelming symphony, conducted by commanders who understood that the first seconds of bombardment would determine whether thousands of their soldiers lived or died on the beaches ahead. The German defenders along the Riviera coast heard it too. They had been waiting, in a sense, for weeks. The Wehrmacht officers stationed in fortified positions around Cannes, Antibes, and the smaller landing beaches had received intelligence reports that an invasion from the Mediterranean was possible, perhaps even likely. Yet nothing quite prepared them for the reality of what descended upon them. The primary target of the bombardment was the coastal fortifications themselves: pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, barbed wire entanglements, and the positions where machine gunners waited in concrete bunkers. The Allied naval bombardment concentrated on destroying these defenses before ground troops arrived. Battleships and heavy cruisers, positioned at ranges of 20,000 yards or more, fired shells weighing hundreds of pounds that could penetrate reinforced concrete. The impact of these projectiles created shock waves that toppled buildings, collapsed fortifications, and sent earth and stone geysers towering into the pre-dawn sky. Smaller vessels, destroyers and frigates, focused on more precise targets, known gun emplacements, observation posts, and supply dumps identified by intelligence photographs and prisoner interrogations. The coordination between these different ship classes was technical, exacting work, refined through months of rehearsal and refined further through hard experience in the Pacific and Mediterranean. But the bombardment was not solely naval. At the same moment the first shells were arriving on French soil, Allied aircraft were climbing into the sky from airfields in North Africa, Sicily, Corsica, and from escort carriers positioned in the Gulf of Lions. The Allies committed more than 1,000 aircraft to the opening hours of Operation Dragoon, an aerial weight of force that would have been unimaginable just 5 years earlier. Fighters swept in ahead of the bombers to suppress German anti-aircraft fire, their machine guns raking the coastal positions with sustained bursts. Then came the medium bombers, Mitchells and Bostons, flying in formation, their bomb bays open, releasing ordnance that scattered across the landscape in cascading patterns. The aircraft did not operate in isolation. They worked in coordination with the naval gunfire, timing their runs to avoid hitting ships or each other, concentrating their effort on areas where the bombardment alone could not reach. Airfields to the north, where German fighters might be scrambled to contest the invasion, were struck with particular ferocity. Supply routes leading toward the landing beaches were interdicted. Bridges across the Rhone Valley were damaged to slow German reinforcements. This was not desperation bombing designed to demoralize civilian populations. This was surgical, focused application of air power in support of a specific military objective, the destruction of German capacity to resist the amphibious assault. The intensity of the bombardment created what military observers called a zone of destruction. This was not hyperbole or exaggeration for dramatic effect. In the areas directly targeted, the beaches of Saint-Tropez, Saint-Maxime, Fréjus, and the approaches to Toulon, the landscape was transformed. Fortifications that had been constructed over months of labor were reduced to rubble in minutes. Bunkers buried under reinforced concrete were penetrated and destroyed. Anti-tank obstacles designed to rip open landing craft were blown apart or rendered ineffective. The German garrison in the beach defences suffered casualties, though the exact numbers remain uncertain because records were lost and survivors never fully accounted for their losses. What is known with certainty is that the bombardment achieved its primary objective. It broke the initial resolve of the defenders and degraded their capacity to resist. German soldiers cowering in bunkers that shook with each near miss, their communications disrupted by blast damage, their commanders unable to coordinate a response, were not in an ideal condition to repel an amphibious assault. The weight of the bombardment announced something that German military strategists had long feared. They were facing an enemy with resources so vast that they could afford to expend enormous quantities of ammunition and fuel simply to clear a path for ground troops. The German response to the bombardment was constrained by factors beyond the control of local commanders. General Wiese, who commanded the German 19th Army, responsible for the defense of southern France, understood immediately that this was not a feint or a probe. He sent urgent messages to Army Group G headquarters, requesting reinforcement and requesting authority to fall back to more defensible positions. But the messages that came back from higher authority were confused and contradictory. Hitler had long insisted that every position must be held to the last man, that retreat was not an option, that the proper response to an attack was a counterattack. Yet Hitler was not present in southern France, and he did not understand the forces arrayed against General Wiese. The bombardment continued without pause. For more than 2 hours, the coastal defences were subjected to a continuous weight of fire. Naval gun crews worked in coordinated rotations, some vessels drawing back to resupply ammunition, while others maintained the intensity of the assault. Aircraft cycled in and out, some returning to bases to rearm while others had already been over the target multiple times. The seamless coordination of this effort represented months of training, technical refinement, and organizational discipline. It also represented something more, the overwhelming material superiority that the Allies now possessed in Europe in the summer of 1944. The sailors and soldiers participating in the bombardment understood its significance even as it was happening. The crews of the capital ships knew that they were providing cover for men who would soon be running across open beaches. The air crews knew that their bombing runs were in direct support of an operation where their success would save lives in the hours to come. There was a grim professionalism to the work. The gunnery officers aboard the bombardment ships worked with technical precision, reading coordinates, adjusting fire based on spotters' reports, maintaining the rate of fire that had been calculated and rehearsed dozens of times before. The aircraft crews followed their bombing runs with discipline, resisting the impulse to deviate from their assigned targets to chase enemy aircraft or to pursue what seemed like more lucrative targets. This discipline was the product of hard-won lessons from earlier amphibious operations. At Sicily, at Salerno, at Taranto, the Allies had learned that the bombardment phase was not an opportunity for individual heroics or tactical improvisation. It was a supporting function that had to be executed with mechanical precision to create the conditions under which the ground assault could succeed. The German attempt to respond to the bombardment was further hampered by the successful deception campaign that had preceded the invasion. German High Command had anticipated an invasion from the Mediterranean, but they had been led to expect it in different locations. Reinforcements that should have been positioned near Cannes and Antibes were instead stationed near Marseille, responding to intelligence reports about invasion preparations near that city. Some German reinforcements had been held in reserve around Lyon and Grenoble, distances from which they could not reach the landing beaches until the afternoon at the earliest. The strategic reserves that might have launched a counterattack against the bridgehead were not available for immediate action. This was the invisible victory that the bombardment represented. The naval guns and aircraft were not only destroying physical fortifications, they were also taking advantage of an enemy that was operationally confused, tactically unprepared, and strategically outmaneuvered before the ground assault even began. In this sense, the bombardment was both the end of one phase of the operation, the deception and intelligence warfare, and the beginning of another, the actual invasion itself. The emotional weight of the bombardment cannot be separated from its physical effects. For German soldiers in the bunkers and fortifications, the experience was terrifying. Men who had endured bombardments before, who understood themselves to be soldiers, found themselves in positions where their courage meant nothing. Artillery and air attacks were impersonal forces that could not be resisted by individual acts of bravery or unit cohesion. Some German soldiers were killed outright. Others were buried by collapsing structures. Still others emerged from their shelters traumatized, their will to resist temporarily shattered by the sheer intensity of the assault. The German officer corps had trained men for sustained operations against conventional enemies, but they had not prepared them for an enemy that could expend thousands of tons of ordnance in a preliminary bombardment before the main assault even began. For the Allied soldiers watching from offshore, the bombardment was a different kind of emotional experience. Many of them would soon be running across open beaches toward entrenched positions. The intensity of the bombardment provided some reassurance. The weight of fire seemed overwhelming. Surely nothing could survive such an assault. Surely the German defenses would be so thoroughly pulverized that the resistance would be minimal. This was a reassurance that had been true more often than not in the Mediterranean campaign, but it was still fundamentally an assumption. No one could be certain until the moment came. The bombardment achieved its calculated objectives with remarkable efficiency. The destruction of the German coastal defenses was comprehensive. Anti-tank obstacles were cleared or neutralized. Machine gun positions were destroyed or abandoned. The communication network that German commanders relied upon was disrupted by blast damage and personnel casualties. Supply dumps were hit and burned. The forward observation posts that German artillery depended upon were destroyed or became untenable to man. By the time the bombardment lifted and the ground assault began, the German defenders along the beaches had suffered not only physical casualties, but also a degradation of their operational capacity. This was the fruit of intensive planning, rigorous training, and ruthless application of material superiority. The bombardment had not been the most dramatic phase of Operation Dragoon, nor would it be the phase that future generations would remember most vividly, but it was the essential foundation upon which everything that followed depended. Without the bombardment, the beaches would have been far more costly to assault. Without the destruction of the German defences, the consolidation of the beachheads would have taken far longer. Without the shock and confusion that the bombardment induced in the German command structure, the subsequent rapid advance inland might not have been possible. The bombardment was not glory or victory or heroism. It was the grinding, technical application of force that made all the human drama that followed possible. And in the early morning hours of the 15th of August, 1944, that application of force was relentless and complete. The silence that followed the bombardment was, in its own way, deafening. As the last shells were fired and the last aircraft withdrew, the smoke and dust hung over the French coast like a shroud. For a brief moment, the war paused. The ships that had carried the invasion fleet held their positions. The aircraft returned to their bases. The soldiers aboard the transports prepared to board their landing craft. In that interval of quiet, before the ground assault began, the scope of what had been accomplished became apparent. The German defences that had seemed formidable weeks earlier, when they were merely lines on a map, had been destroyed. The enemy had been surprised despite intelligence warnings. The weight of Allied firepower had been overwhelming. In a few hours, the invasion would either succeed or fail, but the bombardment had given it every possible advantage. The question now was whether those advantages would be sufficient to overcome the remaining German strength and the uncertainty of war itself. The bombardment had stopped. For the first time in hours, the noise that had hammered the French coast fell away into an eerie, expectant silence. Across the Mediterranean, men in landing craft felt that silence in their bones. Some prayed. Some checked their rifles for the third, fourth, fifth time, hands moving through muscle memory rather than necessity. The sun was rising over southern France, and with it came the moment that months of planning, thousands of prayers, and uncounted doubts were about to collide with reality. At 0800 hours, on the 15th of August, 1944, the first assault troops touched down on the beaches of southern France, and the invasion that would help break Nazi Germany began in earnest. The landing zones stretched across nearly 40 kilometers of coastline. To the west lay Alpha Beach near the town of Saint-Tropez, where American forces pushed ashore into shallow water, still churning from the naval bombardment. To the east, other American units landed at Delta and Camel beaches, facing fortified positions that the German garrison had held for months. Between them and beyond, French commando units touched down at their assigned sectors, their landing craft grinding onto sand still warm from the August sun. The Canadian forces, operating in support of American assault divisions, landed alongside their American counterparts, moving inland with weapons ready. Each beach presented its own tactical puzzle, its own lethal geometry of defending positions, barbed wire, and minefields. The German defenders, though disorganized by the bombardment, still occupied fortified points capable of inflicting serious casualties on troops struggling ashore. The first men to emerge from the landing craft faced a world of controlled chaos. The beach itself had been transformed by hours of naval gunfire and air attack. Defensive obstacles, log and concrete barriers designed to rip open landing craft, lay scattered or destroyed. Craters pocked the sand. Smoke drifted across the water, reducing visibility and adding to the sense of unreality. Behind the beach, German gun positions that had survived the bombardment opened fire on the approaching troops. Machine gun fire crackled across the sand. Mortar rounds began to fall, their distinctive whump followed by explosion and screams. Yet despite this opposition, the assault troops moved forward, splashing through water that deepened to waist height, then chest height, each man vulnerable and exposed in those final terrible seconds before reaching the beach. Some fell into the water and did not rise. Others pushed forward, driven by training, momentum, and the knowledge that stopping meant death just as surely as advancing. What distinguished this invasion from the larger operation at Normandy nearly 10 weeks earlier was the relative weakness of German resistance. The successful deception campaign had worked. German military leadership had convinced itself that the main effort would come against the Italian coast, not southern France. The German 19th Army, stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of Mediterranean coastline, lacked the concentration of forces needed for an effective defense. The troops that did oppose the landing, mostly Eastern European conscripts of questionable motivation, mixed with veteran German units that had been weakened by months of combat and constant alert, fought with determination, but without the overwhelming force that might have thrown the invasion back into the sea. This was not Normandy, where German defences had nearly broken the initial assault. This was an operation where Allied planning, deception, and crushing superiority in naval firepower had created conditions favourable for a successful breakthrough. The assault troops who reached the beach encountered their first moments of genuine combat. Small unit leaders began organising men into groups, pushing forward from the waterline toward the first line of German defensive positions. American engineering units, under intense fire, began clearing mines and obstacles to allow follow-on forces to land safely. French commandos, operating in their own national territory for the first time in over 4 years, fought with a ferocious energy that reflected years of occupation and resistance. Canadian forces, veterans of fighting in Italy and the previous invasion attempts, moved with practiced efficiency, using fire and maneuver to suppress German positions. The confusion that inherently accompanies amphibious assault, units mixing together, communication breaking down, the noise and chaos that makes coherent thought almost impossible, was partially mitigated by the relatively light German opposition. Where the Normandy beaches had witnessed nightmarish traffic jams of troops and vehicles unable to advance, the southern French beaches, though crowded and chaotic, gradually became passable as German resistance was overcome. By mid-morning, the first phase of the assault had achieved its critical objective, the establishment of a lodgment ashore. The initial troops had survived their most vulnerable moments and were consolidating positions inland. Follow-on waves of assault troops were landing, bringing additional firepower and manpower. Engineer units were clearing more beach obstacles, allowing landing craft to deliver vehicles, artillery, and supplies. The German defenders, unable to coordinate an effective counterattack, were being pushed back from their prepared positions. Some German units, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, surrendered in groups. Others fell back toward inland strongpoints, particularly around the town of Toulon to the west and inland toward the hills that dominated the coastal plain. The very speed of the Allied advance surprised German commanders, who had expected a slow, grinding battle for the beaches, and were instead witnessing an enemy that had secured sufficient space to bring overwhelming force to bear. The human experience of those early hours ashore was one of extreme contrasts. For many troops, the actual landing proved less harrowing than the approach. Once ashore, once past the worst of the German fire, men found themselves fighting in relatively familiar terrain. The beaches gave way to roads, villages, and agricultural land, much like what existed in many parts of Europe. The Mediterranean sun was warm, The air smelled of cordite and smoke, but also of pine and salt water. Medics moved among the wounded, performing triage with clinical speed and compassion. Dead men lay scattered on the sand and in the water where they had fallen, a stark reminder of the price of invasion. Yet most of the troops who landed that day experienced not a shattering catastrophe, but a difficult, dangerous, ultimately successful passage from ship to shore. The very units that had expected to be annihilated found themselves advancing against retreating enemies and fighting through abandoned defensive positions. The consolidation of the beachhead proceeded with gathering momentum as the day advanced. By early afternoon, American forces had pushed inland to a depth of roughly 5 kilometers in some sectors. French commandos were consolidating their positions in the eastern sector, meeting minimal resistance as German defenders fell back. Canadian troops, operating in coordination with American units, were establishing strong defensive positions to prevent German counterattacks. Behind them, the beaches were becoming organized ports of entry. More troops landed. Tanks were being driven ashore, their crews scanning the horizon for German armor that might appear to contest the beachhead. Artillery was being positioned, its guns creating a protective umbrella that extended several kilometers inland. Ammunition, rations, medical supplies and fuel were being stacked in organized dumps under the direction of rear echelon personnel. The machinery of amphibious assault, once established ashore, became progressively more difficult for the enemy to dislodge. The Allies had crossed the threshold of vulnerability. They were no longer a fleet dependent on luck and German indecision. They were becoming an army. The first German counterattacks came as evening approached and continued sporadically into the night. German units that had retreated inland began attempting to organize defensive operations or localized counterattacks aimed at reducing the Allied beachhead. These attacks, launched without adequate coordination or overwhelming force, were repulsed by the superior firepower and organization the Allies had brought ashore. American and Canadian artillery, brought into positions during the afternoon and early evening, proved devastatingly effective. German attacks that might have posed serious threats to a less well-armed force were shattered by artillery concentrations before they could close with Allied positions. Some German counterattacks achieved local tactical success, penetrating Allied lines temporarily before being contained and thrown back. But none of these efforts changed the fundamental calculus. The Germans lacked the reserves to mount a decisive counteroffensive, and Allied air superiority, reinforced by hundreds of fighter aircraft operating from Corsica and captured airfields in Normandy, prevented German air intervention or the arrival of reinforcements. As darkness fell on the 15th of August, the sound of combat persisted, but with changing character. The roar of initial assault gave way to the crackle of small arms fire, the distinctive thump of mortars, the periodic thunder of artillery. Troops dug in along the beachhead perimeter, preparing for the night. Wounded men were being treated and evacuated. Supply ships continued to arrive throughout the night, their cargoes being unloaded by working parties moving as fast as darkness and danger allowed. The night itself became a kind of ally and enemy simultaneously. Darkness protected troops from air attack and made German counterattacks more difficult to coordinate. But it also created confusion, made communication challenging, and allowed German defenders to infiltrate and probe Allied positions. Casualties continued to mount, though far below what pre-invasion estimates had feared. Medics worked by lamplight in aid stations, treating wounds, administering plasma and medications, making decisions about who could be evacuated and who would have to remain with the forward troops. The second day of the invasion brought expanded operations. As reinforcements poured ashore, Divisions that had been held in reserve were committed to the fight. The beachhead, secured on the first day, was being rapidly enlarged. American forces pushed deeper into the interior, driving toward the major ports and communications hubs that remained in German hands. The Seventh Army, under General Alexander Patch's command, was beginning to assume the form that would characterize its drive northward into the Rhone Valley. British and Canadian forces, supporting the American assault divisions, were consolidating the eastern flank and preparing to advance toward the town of Nice and the Italian border. Free French forces, landing behind the American assault divisions, were moving to secure areas of the interior, their presence carrying immense symbolic significance for the civilian population of southern France. The momentum that had begun on the first day continued to build. German defenders, unable to concentrate sufficient force to stop the advance, were falling back in disorganized fashion, surrendering in increasing numbers or attempting to extricate themselves northward towards stronger positions and the possibility of linking with other German units. By the 18th of August, 3 days into the invasion, the beachhead had expanded to a depth of roughly 60 kilometers in some sectors. Port facilities at Toulon and Marseille remained in German hands but were surrounded and under siege. The key roads leading northward toward the Rhone Valley were increasingly controlled by Allied forces. German plans to contain the invasion had collapsed. The expected fierce resistance from fortress towns and fortified positions was not materializing. Instead, German defenders were fragmenting into scattered groups, attempting to escape northward or surrender while they still could. The beaches that had seemed so hostile on the morning of the 15th of August had become secure bases from which an entire army was flowing inland, carrying with it overwhelming force, superior organization, and an enemy that had already lost the battle before its outcome became clear. The assault phase was ending, the pursuit phase was beginning. The success of the beach assault on the 15th of August 1944 rested on multiple factors that converged almost perfectly: superior planning, successful deception of German intelligence, crushing air and naval firepower, the weakness of German defenders, and the professional competence of Allied assault troops all played critical roles. But perhaps the most vital factor was speed. The Allies had moved so quickly from ship to shore, and then from shore to deep inland, that German commanders could not coordinate an effective response. By the time senior German officials in Berlin understood the true scope and location of the invasion, the strategic initiative had already passed beyond recovery. The men who had gone ashore in those first hours, who had faced machine gun fire in the surf and mortars on the beach, had not merely achieved a tactical victory. They had broken the back of German defense in southern France and set in motion events that would liberate millions of people and help complete the destruction of Nazi Germany itself. The beach assault was over. The long road north was about to begin. In the hours before dawn on the 15th of August 1944, while the naval bombardment was still minutes away, a different kind of invasion was already underway in the darkness above the Mediterranean. High above the waters, transport aircraft moved in loose formations toward the French coast, their fuselages packed with paratroopers who had spent the previous night in final preparation, checking equipment, reviewing maps of terrain they would soon have to cross in darkness and combat. These were the elite soldiers of the Allied airborne forces, American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and British glider troops, tasked with a mission as dangerous as it was essential. While the beach assault would rely on overwhelming firepower and mass to break through German defenses, the airborne troops would operate in near-total isolation, dropped deep behind enemy lines to disrupt German command and control, cut off escape routes, and seize key road networks that could choke off the Germans' ability to reinforce the coastal defenses or execute an organized retreat. The success or failure of this airborne gamble would determine not just the pace of the initial invasion, but potentially the fate of the entire campaign in southern France. The planning for the airborne component of Operation Dragoon had been contentious and uncertain throughout the spring of 1944. American commanders, drawing on lessons from the airborne operations in Normandy 2 months earlier, understood both the immense potential of vertical envelopment and its terrible risks. Normandy's airborne drops had scattered paratroopers across the countryside, with many units landing in the wrong zones, some in water, others separated from their equipment and command structures. Yet despite the chaos, these scattered troops had achieved enough disruption of German movements to prove that airborne forces could be a force multiplier when employed with sufficient numbers and tactical surprise. For Dragoon, the planners decided to use airborne troops more surgically than in Normandy, focusing the drops on specific objectives rather than attempting to secure a broad area. The primary mission was the seizure of key terrain in the Ardèche region and the upper reaches of the Rhône Valley, positions that would allow the Allies to block German retreat routes and prevent the enemy from concentrating reinforcements against the beach assault. The plan called for approximately 6,000 paratroopers and glider troops to land inland, a significant commitment, but less ambitious than the Normandy operation, reflecting the lessons learned and the reality that the Germans in southern France were fewer and more thinly stretched than the defenders of Normandy. The American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division received their final briefings during the afternoon of the 14th of August, in briefing tents scattered across airfields near Naples and in North Africa. Commanders went over the drop zones methodically. The 1st Battalion would land near the town of Le Mouilly, roughly 25 kilometers inland from the coast, to secure a vital crossroads and block German movement along the main road network. Other units would land near Draguignan and along secondary routes, creating a network of blocking positions that would, in theory, funnel German movements into killing zones where they could be destroyed by Allied air power and artillery. The paratroopers knew the plan in broad outline, but the full weight of their task was left somewhat abstract by necessity. Combat is never predictable, and the maps they studied bore only a rough relationship to the actual terrain they would encounter in darkness. They checked their parachutes, loaded ammunition and grenades into their equipment harnesses, and tried to rest. Many could not sleep. Some wrote letters, though many knew these letters might never be sent if they did not survive the night. Others simply sat in the darkness with their thoughts, each man alone with whatever fears or prayers or grim determination sustained him as he contemplated the jump to come. The transport aircraft began their takeoff runs in the gathering darkness, climbing into the night sky in precise formation. The planes climbed to altitude slowly, their engines struggling under the weight of fuel, equipment, and human cargo. Inside the fuselages, men sat in tight rows along the sides, their legs intertwined, their weapons and equipment creating a tangle of metal and canvas. The roar of the engines was constant and deafening, making conversation impossible. Some men stared straight ahead, their faces blank with concentration or fear. Others checked and rechecked their equipment with nervous compulsion, and still others appeared to sleep, though whether they truly did or merely closed their eyes against the overwhelming sensory assault was impossible to know. The flight to the drop zones would take roughly 2 hours, giving them time to consider what awaited. Some pilots had been explicitly ordered to fly low and slow over the drop zones to ensure accurate delivery, but low and slow meant they would be vulnerable to German anti-aircraft fire. Other pilots, aware of this danger, began to climb to higher altitudes. a decision that seemed wise from the perspective of the aircraft's survival, but that would scatter the paratroopers across a vastly larger area, making unit cohesion nearly impossible to maintain after landing. As the transport formations neared the French coast, they began to encounter German anti-aircraft fire, the tracers streaking upward through the darkness, some rounds hitting the aircraft, others missing by meters. Several transports were damaged or destroyed, some paratroopers killed before they ever left the ground, others forced to jump from damaged aircraft in positions far removed from their assigned drop zones. The pilots, faced with anti-aircraft fire, faced an impossible choice: maintain course and altitude for accurate delivery, or take evasive action that might save the aircraft but scatter the troops. Many chose evasion, and the formations began to break apart, each pilot responding individually to the threats they perceived. The result was chaos, but it was chaos that began to play out according to patterns that would become familiar. Some parachutists landed in the correct zones and were able to establish coherent positions. Many others landed miles away, scattered across the French countryside in small groups or isolated individuals. Some landed in trees, hanging suspended in the darkness, struggling to cut themselves free. Others landed in water or in villages still occupied by German forces, where they were immediately engaged in firefights in the pitch darkness. The scattering that had plagued Normandy was happening again, and yet the operation was not doomed by it, because the paratroopers, once scattered, began to do what elite soldiers do. They organized, improvised, and moved toward their assigned objectives or toward the sound of other American voices. In the town of Limoux and its surroundings, paratroopers began to gather in small groups as the darkness gradually gave way to the grey light of dawn. The town itself was defended by a company of German soldiers, perhaps 100 men, positioned in fortified buildings and along the main road. The American paratroopers, still assembling and consolidating, began to engage the German position with increasingly effective fire as their numbers grew. The Germans, initially shocked by the appearance of American soldiers in their rear, fought with discipline, but they were rapidly being outmaneuvered and outgunned. By mid-morning, the Americans had surrounded the German position, and after several hours of firefighting, the German commander made the decision to surrender rather than see his men slaughtered. Nearly all the German soldiers in Limoux became prisoners, and the Americans had secured their first major objective. Yet the struggle for that small town had consumed the morning, and it demonstrated a pattern that would repeat across the inland zones. Small German garrisons, determined but often isolated and cut off from higher command, would make stands in towns and crossroads, inflict casualties on the Americans, but ultimately be overwhelmed by sheer force of numbers and American firepower once the paratroopers achieved local superiority. The British glider troops, who had been towed across the Mediterranean and released to glide to their landing zones, faced their own perils and victories. Glider operations are inherently fragile. The gliders themselves are vulnerable aircraft with no engines and no defense against enemy fire, and the landing zones must be reasonably flat and clear of obstacles. The Allies had prepared the glider landing zones with reconnaissance, and they had inserted advance parties of paratroopers to mark safe zones and suppress German fire. Yet several glider formations came under fire as they descended, and some gliders were shot down before they could land. Others crashed on landing, disgorging their passengers into chaos and injury. But those that landed successfully delivered highly trained troops who were often better equipped and more heavily armed than paratroopers, and these glider soldiers quickly consolidated and began to move toward their assigned objectives. The British units, like the Americans, found themselves scattered and forced to improvise. but they moved with the professional discipline of experienced troops, and they began to establish blocking positions along the roads that German forces would need to use if they attempted to retreat or concentrate. Throughout the 15th of August, the scattered airborne units began to achieve their mission's intent, despite the dispersion that should have destroyed their effectiveness. Small groups of paratroopers would establish positions on key roads, setting up ambushes and defensive lines that threatened any German movement. When German convoys or reinforcing units encountered these American soldiers, the Germans were forced to deploy, engage, and often divert from their routes. The paratroopers had no artillery support, no tanks, no means of holding ground against a determined large-scale assault, but they did not need to. They needed only to delay and disrupt, and this they accomplished with ruthless effectiveness. By holding the roads and blocking terrain, they made it impossible for German commanders in the south to rapidly concentrate reserves and push back the beach assault. They also created a zone of uncertainty and fear among the German troops, who could not determine how many enemy soldiers were in their rear or what strength they possessed. Rumors grew and spread. Messages sent from division to corps commanders were interrupted or delayed. The coherent German response to Operation Dragoon that might have been possible was fractured before it could coalesce. The airborne operation's success was purchased with blood. The paratroopers, fighting in scattered small units against an enemy they could not always see, suffered significant casualties. Some men were killed in their parachutes as they descended through German fire. Others were wounded during the firefights in villages and on roads and were unable to receive proper medical care. Still others simply vanished into the French countryside, captured or killed or lost in terrain they did not know. Estimates of American airborne casualties in the Operation Dragoon landings ranged from several hundred to over 1,000, with roughly half killed and half wounded or captured. This was a steep price, and it was paid in a single night and morning of combat. Yet it was a price that the commanders judged acceptable when measured against the larger mission. The paratroopers had achieved all their assigned objectives. Le Mouille was secured. The main road network in the interior was disrupted. German reinforcements could not move freely. And when the beach assault forces began to break out from their beachheads and move inland, they found roads open and German opposition weakened by the need to deal with threats in their rear. The junction between the scattered airborne units and the advancing beach forces occurred over several days as the American assault troops fought their way inland and linked up with paratroopers who had been holding positions sometimes against overwhelming odds. The paratroopers, who had been isolated in the darkness and then in small units throughout the 15th, looked with profound relief on the arrival of organized formations of American infantry and armor. Some of these young paratroopers had fired every round of ammunition they had and were fighting with captured German weapons or hand-to-hand combat when the armor arrived. The connection between airborne and beach forces represented a transformation of the operation from a risky, potentially catastrophic gamble into a coherent advance that could no longer be stopped or even significantly delayed by German resistance. The airborne troops had accepted the risk of scattered drops and isolated combat because they understood that this was the price of achieving surprise and bypassing German defenses. They had paid the price in blood and in the fear of men fighting alone in enemy territory, and they had delivered results that no amount of planning or precision in navigation could have guaranteed if the plan had been cautious and constrained. The airborne operation in Operation Dragoon is often overlooked in historical narratives that focus on the larger beach landings and the subsequent pursuit inland. Yet this operation represented one of the most ambitious uses of airborne forces in the war in Europe, and it succeeded in ways that earlier airborne operations had only partially achieved. The planners had learned from Normandy. They understood that perfection in drop zone accuracy was less important than achieving operational surprise and establishing sufficient presence in the German rear to disrupt enemy command and control. They had accepted the costs of this strategy: the scattered drops, the isolated firefights, the casualties among paratroopers who had to fight without the support that soldiers on a coordinated front could expect. And these costs had been paid. But in return, they had disabled the German ability to respond to the beach landings with any coherence or force. They had demonstrated that airborne soldiers, even when scattered and improvising, could achieve mission objectives if they possessed training, courage, and willingness to accept risk. They had created conditions that would allow the beach forces to break out and begin the rapid advance that would destroy the German army in southern France within weeks. The memory of the airborne assault faded quickly from public consciousness in the years after the war, overshadowed by the larger and more comprehensible narrative of the beach landings and the chase up the Rhone Valley. Yet the veterans of the airborne operation, the paratroopers who jumped that night, the glider soldiers who descended in their fragile craft, the men who established positions on roads in darkness and held them against counterattack, carried the knowledge of what they had accomplished. They had accepted the gamble of vertical envelopment, the risk that comes with landing behind enemy lines with limited support, and they had transformed that risk into victory. They had demonstrated that modern warfare could be fought not just along linear fronts, but in 3 dimensions, with forces arriving from the sky to encircle and disable conventional armies. The tactical lesson would influence airborne doctrine for the rest of the century. But there was also a human lesson in the airborne assault on southern France, that soldiers, even when frightened and scattered and fighting in darkness, can achieve extraordinary things when they are well trained, well motivated, and clear on their purpose. This was the gamble that paid off, and it was a gamble that the paratroopers and glider troops themselves understood and accepted as they checked their equipment in those final hours before takeoff. On the morning of the 15th of August, 1944, as Allied ships released their cargo of men and machines onto the beaches of southern France, the German command apparatus in occupied Europe was fractured by doubt and constraint. The invasion that had been theoretically anticipated for months arrived nonetheless as a shock, not because the Germans lacked the intellect to predict it, but because their military structure had been hollowed out by the demands of fighting on multiple fronts and the paralyzing interference of Adolf Hitler himself. High command in Berlin had become less a unified force of strategic decision than a collection of competing power centers, each jealously guarding resources and authority, while the Führer arbitrated disputes with decisions that often defied military logic. In the Mediterranean theater, German commanders possessed detailed knowledge of their defensive positions along the southern French coast, yet they lacked the troops, the mobility, and the freedom of action necessary to mount an effective counteroffensive. What unfolded over the next 72 hours was not a coordinated German defense, but rather a desperate improvisation born of strategic miscalculation, delayed intelligence, and a command structure so constrained by Hitler's will that German generals found themselves fighting not only the Allies, but their own government's rigid doctrine and flawed assumptions. General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding German forces in southern France, possessed more than 4 decades of military experience and a reputation for competence that had sustained him through the Nazi regime's volatile leadership. His Army Group G, stretched across a vast territory from the Pyrenees to northern Italy, numbered somewhere in the vicinity of 400,000 men on paper, yet the majority of these troops were second-rate formations, older reservists, convalescents returning from hospitals, and foreign volunteers of questionable loyalty whose effectiveness in combat remained untested and suspect. The best divisions, the hardened panzer and mechanized units that could have mounted a serious counterattack, had been stripped away months earlier to reinforce the Eastern Front, where the grinding meat grinder of the Soviet advance consumed German military resources with brutal efficiency. What remained for Blaskowitz was a patchwork force spread so thinly across the southern French landscape that no single sector possessed sufficient reserves to withstand a determined assault. The reality that Blaskowitz understood, and that he had communicated repeatedly to Berlin, was that his command could inflict delays upon an invading force, but could not prevent its initial lodgment, or once established, push it back into the sea. This assessment, reasonable and grounded in operational reality, was nonetheless received in Berlin with frustration and dismissal by figures who had never visited the front and whose understanding of warfare had calcified into doctrine rather than adapting to changing circumstances. The deception campaign orchestrated by the Allies in the weeks before Dragoon proved devastatingly effective precisely because it exploited the existing predispositions and fears of German commanders. Intelligence reports, some accurate and some deliberately falsified, painted a picture of a massive invasion force gathering in Italy with the intention of landing near Genoa and the Italian Riviera, thus threatening the German southern flank and the vital supply corridors through the Alps. This threat, though largely phantom, seemed credible to German planners because it aligned with the logic of an enemy seeking the shortest possible distance to Germany and the richest prize in seized territory. Consequently, substantial German reserves that might otherwise have been positioned in southern France were instead locked in place in northern Italy, held in defensive posture against an invasion that was never coming. The Luftwaffe, already weakened by losses in the north and the relentless expansion of American fighter strength, dispersed its already scarce aircraft between multiple possible threat zones, unable to concentrate its meager forces where they might make a difference. When the true invasion struck on the 15th of August, the German High Command experienced a moment of profound disorientation, followed by a furious scramble to understand what had happened and how to respond. The precious hours of early morning, when a coordinated and rapid response might have disrupted the Allied landing operations before they became established, were instead consumed by confused communications, contradictory intelligence assessments, and the grinding process of moving forces through a French rail network that partisan activity had rendered increasingly unreliable. Hitler's direct intervention in the Mediterranean crisis proved almost immediately counterproductive, shaped by his obsession with holding every inch of territory and his conviction that any German unit that retreated was evidence of command failure and insufficient will to victory. The Führer issued orders throughout the 15th and 16th of August that reflected no understanding of the speed of the Allied advance or the actual disposition of German forces in southern France, instead demanding that Blaskowitz hold fixed lines and mount immediate counterattacks with formations that were neither sufficiently concentrated nor adequately equipped for such operations. One of Hitler's key decisions was to refuse permission for General Blaskowitz to conduct a fighting withdrawal towards stronger defensive positions, insisting instead that the initial defensive line be held at any cost, as if holding a particular piece of geography mattered more than preserving the German army's capacity to continue resisting. This directive, issued from Berlin by men who had not set foot in the region and who possessed no detailed knowledge of the terrain or the actual German troop strength available, effectively guaranteed that whatever German forces were committed to the defense of the beachheads would be destroyed or captured in place, rather than extricated to fight another day. The contrast between Hitler's fantasy of heroic last stands and the grinding military reality faced by officers like Blaskowitz created a chasm of understanding that no amount of radio traffic or written orders could bridge. German generals in the field understood that their only rational course of action was to slow the Allied advance and extract as many troops as possible northward toward more defensible terrain. Yet they received orders demanding the reverse. Aggressive counterattacks launched with inadequate force against an enemy possessing overwhelming superiority in manpower, armor, and air support. The movements of German reserves in response to the invasion represented a kind of military tragedy in which each decision, individually defensible or at least understandable, cumulatively ensured catastrophic failure. General Wiese, commanding the German 19th Army in the immediate vicinity of the landing zones, gathered available mobile forces and attempted to organize counterattacks toward the beachheads within the first 12 hours of the invasion. But these attacks, launched piecemeal and without sufficient artillery or air support, were repulsed with heavy losses by Allied forces that possessed absolute air superiority and overwhelming firepower. Each failed counterattack consumed reserves that Wiese could never replace. Each rebuff of German columns demonstrated the futility of meeting the Allied advances in conventional combat, and yet the orders from above continued demanding more offensive action, more courage, more willingness to sacrifice. The 11th Panzer Division, one of the few truly capable German formations still available in the Mediterranean theatre, was moved northward from Marseille toward the invasion zone. But its movement consumed precious time, and its forces, when finally committed to combat, found themselves attacking against prepared defensive positions held by fresh Allied troops and bombarded by naval gunfire that had no German counterpart. Reconnaissance elements and forward detachments of the panzer divisions clashed with Allied paratroops and airborne troops who had landed inland to secure blocking positions. And the confusion of these encounters, in which small units of elite paratroopers dispersed across the French countryside, inflicted disproportionate casualties upon larger German formations, searching for an enemy that had deliberately dissolved into the landscape and prepared ambush positions, further eroded German confidence in their ability to contain the invasion. By the 17th of August, less than 2 days after the landings began, the true scope of the German dilemma had become apparent to every senior officer in the Mediterranean theatre, even if it remained obscured in the euphemisms and self-deceptions that filtered up through the German command chain to Berlin. The Allies were landing not merely the initial assault waves, but were sustaining their beachheads with continuous flow of reinforcements, heavy equipment, and supplies that poured ashore at a rate that matched or exceeded German estimates of what the Allies could achieve. Air superiority, unchallenged and absolute, meant that German formations could move only at night, traveling slowly and cautiously, lest they invite the devastating attention of Allied fighter bombers that hunted any moving target. The German army had no counter to this reality. No adequate air force, no anti-aircraft defenses sufficient to deter Allied pilots, and no strategic reserves that could be committed to achieve breakthrough. The radius of the German encirclement was already expanding outward from the invasion zone, and German commanders suddenly confronted the prospect that the Allies' intent was not merely to seize the beaches and capture a few towns, but to drive northward rapidly enough to link with the American and British armies descending from Normandy, thereby trapping all of Army Group G in a cauldron from which escape would become impossible. This catastrophic realization emerged first among the tactical commanders closest to the fighting, then spread upward through the German command structure, encountering as it rose the desperate refusal of Hitler and his court to acknowledge that defeat was not merely possible, but increasingly inevitable. The road networks of southern France became the focus of German strategic concern, as commanders desperately sought to identify escape routes for their forces before the encirclement closed. The Rhone Valley offered the most direct path northward, but the valley's narrowness meant that a rapid Allied advance up the valley would cut it off and trap any German forces still south of the advance. German staffs began calculating the time remaining for withdrawal, the distance that needed to be travelled, the speed of Allied advance, and these calculations invariably led to the same bleak conclusion: there was not sufficient time and speed to extract all of the German forces. Decisions had to be made about which units would attempt to break through northward and which would be sacrificed to cover the retreat, and these decisions fell ultimately to officers in the field, as the orders from Berlin grew increasingly incoherent and contradictory. The German commanders understood that they were managing not victory, but merely the rate of their own defeat, trying to preserve whatever forces they could from the gathering catastrophe. Blaskowitz's situation had become one of managing a controlled dissolution of an army, under conditions where no withdrawal could be truly controlled or truly orderly. The distances were immense, the enemy was relentless and possessed overwhelming firepower, and the men under German command were exhausted and increasingly demoralized by the realization that the battles of the past few days had cost them heavily without achieving anything but delay. The reality of German command failure crystallized around a series of moments in which the military situation shifted from bad to irretrievable. By the morning of the 18th of August, Allied forces had already expanded their beachheads to encompass several of the primary landing zones, and American formations were pushing inland faster than German intelligence had deemed possible. The German 19th Army, which should have possessed the capability to contain, or at least to slow this advance, found itself in fragments, some units still in contact with the Allies along the coast, others dispersed inland searching for airborne troops who had vanished into the French countryside, still others being hastily reorganized into new defensive formations that possessed no time for reconnaissance or proper deployment. Communication between German headquarters became increasingly fragmented as the chaos of battle and the constant movement of forces stretched the signal networks beyond their capacity. Officers discovered that orders issued in the morning had become outdated by noon, that the situation maps at headquarters bore decreasing resemblance to the actual disposition of forces in the field, and that every assumption about where the Allies would strike next proved wrong, as the Allies, moving with speed and decisiveness, simply bypassed German defensive preparations and drove deeper into occupied France. The cumulative effect was a command structure that was still intact on paper, but had become increasingly divorced from operational reality, issuing orders to units that had been destroyed or captured, or had already moved beyond the area to which the orders applied. German officers in the field faced a terrible choice that no written order could resolve: obey the commands from Berlin to hold fixed lines and counterattack, knowing this meant certain destruction of the forces committed, or exercise initiative and conduct a fighting withdrawal that would preserve German military force, but would constitute direct disobedience to the Führer's explicit directives. Some commanders, brave in their way, attempted to do both simultaneously, holding delaying positions while quietly moving units northward, in hope of preserving enough force to continue resisting, while still maintaining the facade of compliance with Hitler's orders. Others simply conducted the withdrawal they deemed militarily necessary and faced the consequences afterward, or else discovered that their radios had become mysteriously unable to receive the orders from higher headquarters that might have contradicted their decisions. The German officer corps in southern France faced not merely an Allied enemy, but an internal civil war between those who believed in continuing to fight under Hitler's absolute command and those who recognized that Germany's situation was hopeless and that the only rational action remaining was to preserve what could be preserved and save lives where possible. This division of will and purpose within the German command structure mirrored the larger fracture developing within Nazi Germany, as the military situation deteriorated toward obvious collapse. The psychological impact of the invasion upon German officers and men cannot be understated. Many of the soldiers defending the French coast were aware, at least dimly, that Germany had already lost the war in the east, that the Soviet armies were advancing deeper into Eastern Europe with each passing month, and that the American and British invasions from the west meant that Germany was being crushed between two advancing enemies, whose combined power vastly exceeded anything Germany could field. The myth of German military superiority had sustained the German army through years of retreat and defeat, but the Allies' display of organizational competence, their ability to land hundreds of thousands of troops in enemy territory and sustain them through a continuous supply line stretching back across the Mediterranean, their command of the air and of the sea, their possession of more armor and artillery than the Germans could match. All of this demonstrated a material and organizational superiority that no amount of tactical skill or individual courage could overcome. German soldiers who had fought in North Africa, who had survived the catastrophe of Stalingrad or the massive tank battle at Kursk, who had endured the long retreat from the Soviet Union, understood in their bones what the invasion of southern France meant, that Germany had lost the war and was now merely fighting out the clock in hope that some diplomatic solution might yet save them from complete annihilation. This knowledge, though often unspoken, nonetheless permeated the German army in 1944 and contributed to the erosion of fighting spirit and the increasing tendency of German units to surrender when further resistance appeared futile. By the 20th of August, barely 5 days after the invasion began, the German command realized that the hoped-for defense of southern France had become impossible and that the only question remaining was how many troops could be extracted from the closing encirclement. Blaskowitz had already issued orders for Army Group G to begin its withdrawal northward, orders that contradicted Hitler's directives but reflected the military reality that every hour of delay cost German lives, and that no amount of additional sacrifice would change the outcome. The trap was closing around the German forces with relentless speed. American and French forces from the Dragoon invasion were driving northward up the Rhone Valley, at rates that far exceeded German ability to retreat, while the beaches of southern France were no longer quiet. By the 15th of August at 0800 hours, the first waves of assault troops had crossed the sand and begun their desperate push inland. What had been a distant rumor to the defenders of German-occupied France was now a reality that could not be denied or delayed. The bombardment that had shredded the coastal fortifications had done its work well, yet pockets of organized resistance remained, dug into villages and fortified strongpoints beyond the reach of naval gunfire. American riflemen, Canadian engineers, and Free French soldiers fanned out from the beaches with deliberate urgency, knowing that the window of surprise would close within hours. Behind them, in steadily growing waves, came support troops, ammunition carriers, medical orderlies, and the thousand small components of modern warfare that transform a beachhead from a precarious foothold into a launching point for advance. The first hours after landing were the most dangerous hours, for the Germans could still mount local counterattacks before the Allies achieved overwhelming numerical superiority ashore. In the American sector centered on the beaches near San Rafael and Fréjus, the 7th Army under General Alexander Patch moved with methodical purpose through the initially light resistance. The German defenders, confused by the scale of the assault and still uncertain whether Dragoon represented the main invasion or a subsidiary thrust, had not organized a coherent defense in depth. Instead, scattered detachments fought delaying actions, inflicting casualties but unable to stem the tide of men and machines flowing inland. By midday on the 15th, American infantrymen had pushed several kilometers from the beaches, clearing villages street by street and establishing defensive positions against the expected German counterattacks. The world of southern France, so different from the bocage and hedgerows of Normandy, offered fewer natural obstacles to rapid movement. The hills rolled back from the coast in gentle undulations, mostly open terrain where armor could maneuver and where the Allies' superior artillery and air support could be brought to devastating effect. American commanders pushed their troops forward with steady pressure, knowing that speed and momentum would count for more in the coming days than careful, methodical clearing of every position. The Canadian and British forces, operating in adjacent sectors to the west, encountered somewhat stiffer resistance as they pushed toward the port cities and industrial heartland of southern France. These troops, many of them veterans of the Italian campaign or of earlier fighting in North Africa, moved with the competence that comes from hard experience. They secured key road junctions and village crossroads that would be vital to the overall advance, and they linked their operations with the American forces to prevent any German breakthrough between the separated commands. The scale of logistics required to support these expanding operations was staggering. Supply ships continued to arrive throughout the first days ashore, offloading ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical supplies across hastily organized beaches. Engineers worked feverishly to establish beach dumps, to clear obstacles, and to begin the construction of port facilities that would allow the Allies to bring ashore the thousands of tons of materiel needed to sustain an army in rapid advance. By the 16th of August, more than 100,000 troops had landed on the beaches of southern France, and the figure would continue to climb as the days passed. The German response to Operation Dragoon, though ultimately futile, was not entirely absent during these early days. German commanders at the corps and division level attempted to organize counterattacks against the expanding beachheads, hoping to contain or repel the invasion before it could establish itself firmly ashore. These efforts were hampered by the poor coordination imposed by Hitler's strategic doctrine, by the delay in releasing reserves that had been held far from the threatened coast, and by the sheer weight of Allied firepower that could be concentrated against any German concentration. Some German divisions, such as the 11th Panzer Division, managed to assemble and launch attacks against the American beachhead, but these assaults were broken up by artillery fire, by coordinated defense, and by the constant threat of air attack from Allied fighter bombers that dominated the skies above southern France. German losses in men and equipment mounted quickly, and the counterattacks, which had begun with determination and tactical boldness, gradually gave way to a grim recognition among German officers that the battle was already lost. The only question was whether they could extract their forces and conduct a fighting retreat before the Allies completely encircled them. From the 15th to the 18th of August, the campaign ashore developed a distinctive rhythm and character. During the daytime hours, the Allies pushed forward methodically, clearing towns and villages, establishing supply lines, and expanding the perimeter of their control. German resistance stiffened in some locations and collapsed in others, depending on the competence of local commanders, the availability of reserves, and the degree of surprise that could be achieved. At night, the pace of advance generally slowed as the Allies consolidated their gains and prepared for renewed German counterattacks that often came in darkness. The combat itself, though often intense in isolated locations, never developed into the massive set-piece battles that had characterized the fighting in Normandy after D-Day. Instead, it consisted of a series of sharp encounters, ambushes in narrow village streets, firefights in open country where superior Allied firepower could be brought to bear, and the constant grinding advance of an army that knew it held the upper hand. Casualty rates remained moderate by the standards of modern warfare, though every man killed or wounded represented an individual tragedy and a loss to his unit's fighting strength. The race for the major ports of southern France, Toulon and Marseille, became a dominant feature of operations during these early days ashore. These two cities represented more than just symbolic objectives. They were vital logistical centers whose possession would transform the Allies' ability to supply and sustain their advance northward. Toulon lay roughly 80 kilometers west of the main American landing zones, and Marseille lay even farther, but both lay within striking distance of the rapidly advancing Allied columns. German defenders in both cities understood the strategic value of their positions and fought with determination to delay the Allied advance, hoping to extract themselves and their equipment before encirclement. The Allies, sensing the opportunity to trap substantial German forces, pushed hard to cut off the roads leading out of these cities and to force the defenders into surrender or destruction. Local French resistance fighters, finally given the opportunity to rise against their German oppressors, emerged from hiding to attack German positions from behind, to block roads, and to provide intelligence to the advancing Allied forces. The combination of Allied military pressure and the uprising of French civilians against their occupiers created an increasingly desperate situation for the German defenders. The flow of combat intelligence to Allied commanders during these early days was considerably better than it had been during the Normandy campaign. The Dragoon planners had benefited from extensive aerial reconnaissance, from signals intelligence, and from human intelligence gathered by the resistance and by Allied agents operating in southern France before the invasion. This meant that commanders generally had a reasonably accurate picture of German dispositions and intentions, and they could adjust their plans accordingly. German commanders, conversely, labored under the handicap of incomplete and sometimes contradictory information about where the Allies were moving and what their objectives were. This information advantage, combined with the Germans' overall inferiority in numbers and firepower, made the outcome of the campaign increasingly inevitable as the days passed. By the 17th of August, American forces were operating well inland, having established a beachhead that extended several dozen kilometers from the coast in some places. The Allies' initial foothold had been transformed into a substantial territory under their control, defended by a growing garrison of troops and continuously reinforced by fresh arrivals from the Mediterranean fleet. The civilian population of southern France experienced these early days of liberation with a complex mixture of emotions that deserved recognition and understanding. For those who lived in combat zones, the arrival of the Allies meant not instant peace but immediate danger. Artillery fire did not distinguish between German soldiers and French civilians, and houses used for military purposes became targets regardless of who occupied them. Thousands of French men and women found themselves caught between two armies, forced to flee their homes or to shelter in basements and cellars while the battle raged overhead. Yet there was also undeniable joy and relief at the knowledge that liberation was finally at hand, that the years of occupation were drawing to a close, and that the liberation of France was no longer a distant hope, but a reality taking shape in real time. In towns and villages where German defenders had withdrawn without resistance, French civilians emerged from their homes to greet the Allied soldiers, to provide them with water and food, and to begin the process of reclaiming their communities from Nazi occupation. The resistance fighters, emboldened by the presence of Allied forces, took on increasingly active roles in the campaign, attacking German rear echelon troops, sabotaging supply lines, and providing tactical support to the advancing Allied units. Medical services during these early days ashore were strained to the breaking point by the sheer volume of casualties flowing back from the advancing combat lines. Field hospitals were established close behind the beachhead, and hospital ships that had crossed the Mediterranean stood offshore, ready to receive the most severely wounded for evacuation to facilities in North Africa or Italy. Surgeons worked without rest, operating on a conveyor belt of wounded men. Nurses and orderlies performed their duties with the kind of quiet heroism that never garnered the headlines of combat victories, but was equally essential to keeping the Allies' advance moving forward. Supply lines that had been established only hours before were rapidly pushed inland to keep pace with the advancing frontline troops. Ammunition trucks ground inland along roads that had been hastily cleared of obstacles. Fuel tankers kept the tanks, trucks, and jeeps supplied with the gasoline that modern warfare demanded in vast quantities. The logistical support structure that had been planned and rehearsed throughout the spring was now being tested against the reality of rapid advance and fluid combat. The German command structure, fractured and confused, struggled to respond effectively to the crisis unfolding in southern France. Hitler, operating from his headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia, refused to accept that the invasion could not be repelled. He issued orders for counterattacks that German commanders recognized as futile, but could not openly disobey without risking their careers or their lives. Orders and counterorders flowed through the German military hierarchy, each one consuming time and creating confusion. German divisions that might have been used effectively to defend specific objectives were instead dispersed in search of an elusive counterstroke that never materialized. The German commander on the spot, General Johannes Blaskowitz, attempted to organize a coordinated defense and a fighting withdrawal, but his hands were tied by the strategic dictates of the Nazi regime. Units that could have been extracted to fight again were instead committed to hopeless defensive positions. Resources that might have been husbanded for a final defense of the German homeland were thrown away in futile attempts to contain an invasion that was already certain to succeed. By the 18th of August, just 3 days after the initial landings, the shape of the Dragoon campaign had become clear to all who bothered to observe objectively. The Allies had established themselves ashore with overwhelming strength, and they were advancing inland with steady momentum that was gathering speed rather than being slowed. German attempts to mount organized counterattacks had failed, and the defenders were being pushed back toward the interior of France. The ports that the Allies coveted were within reach, and the German forces defending them were increasingly at risk of encirclement. Supply lines were flowing steadily through the beachheads, bringing ashore the materiel needed to sustain the expanding offensive. American, Canadian, British, and Free French forces had all established themselves successfully in southern France, and they were beginning to operate in closer coordination as the first days of the campaign gave way to the sustained advance that would characterize the weeks ahead. The weather, which had been the subject of intense concern during the planning phases, had held steady, allowing continuous air operations and the uninterrupted flow of supplies across the Mediterranean. What had begun as a gamble, a second invasion of occupied France from the sea, had proven itself to be a strategic success. The Germans had lost the first battle for southern France, and they were rapidly running out of time to prevent a complete military catastrophe in the region. The beaches of southern France had been secured. The beachheads, won at terrible cost over 3 long days, now held firm against German counterattacks. But the real test of Operation Dragoon was not the landing itself, it was what came next. As the 15th of August turned into the 16th and the 17th, the true scope of the Allies' gambit became clear. The goal was not merely to hold a strip of coastline. The goal was to move north, fast, into the heart of occupied France, and to do so before the German army could organize its escape. The race had begun, and every hour mattered. General Alexander Patch, commanding the American 7th Army, understood the strategic imperative with absolute clarity. If his forces could move swiftly enough up the Rhône Valley, they could cut off the retreat of German defenders, who were now caught between 2 Allied armies, Eisenhower's forces bearing down from Normandy in the north, and Dragoon forces pushing up from the south. The Germans had a narrow window to escape. The Allies had a narrow window to slam it shut. Everything depended on who moved faster. By the 18th of August, American columns were pushing northward in force. The coastal cities of Toulon and Marseille, which had been expected to resist for weeks, fell within days due to a combination of Allied assault and internal revolt by French resistance fighters and sympathetic civilians. The fall of these major ports was not merely a tactical victory. It was proof that the German position was collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. Supply lines that had fed German garrisons in southern France for 4 years were severing. Communication networks were breaking apart. And behind the front lines, French civilians who had endured occupation since 1940 were beginning to emerge from their homes, watching in amazement as the symbols of Nazi control vanished from their streets. Some threw flowers, some wept openly, some armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find and joined the pursuit of retreating Germans. The liberation was no longer a distant hope whispered in darkened cafes. It was becoming a visible, tangible reality, unfolding hour by hour across the landscape. The route northward from the coast followed the Rhône Valley, a natural corridor that led directly toward Lyon and Grenoble. This was no accident of geography. It was precisely why the German High Command had always feared invasion from the south. The valley was a funnel, wide enough for rapid movement, but narrow enough that defensive positions along its length could theoretically have slowed or halted an advance. But the Germans had neither the forces nor the time to establish such a defense. Most German soldiers in southern France were already in retreat, either individually or in fragmented units, desperate to reach the relative safety of the German frontier or to link up with other retreating formations. The roads that led north were clogged with military transport, abandoned vehicles, and desperate men trying to escape the advancing Allies. It was a scene of organized panic, soldiers still carrying weapons and maintaining some semblance of unit cohesion, but moving with the grim awareness that encirclement was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was becoming inevitable. The American forces that pursued them were stretched thin themselves, but they moved with a momentum that was hard to resist. Spearheading the advance were motorized columns, trucks, jeeps, and light armored vehicles carrying infantry that had been trained and prepared for exactly this kind of rapid pursuit. Behind them came the heavier equipment, the artillery pieces and supply trucks that would be needed for sustained operations. The weather favored the Allies. The skies over southern France in mid-August remained mostly clear, allowing Allied air forces to maintain constant pressure on German columns. Every road intersection became a killing ground for German transports that could not find cover. Every forced march north became an ordeal under the threat of Allied fighter bombers that appeared without warning from the Mediterranean sky. German soldiers who had survived the landings found themselves hunted in the open, unable to rest, unable to organize an effective defense, knowing only that they had to keep moving or be captured or killed. The psychological effect was devastating. Morale crumbled, not because men lacked courage, but because the situation had become manifestly hopeless. The city of Grenoble lay more than 200 kilometers north of the landing beaches, nestled in the Alps at the confluence of several river valleys. For the Allies, Grenoble was not merely a geographic objective, it was a symbol and a strategic keystone. Capture Grenoble, and the German forces attempting to escape northeastward toward the Alps and toward Switzerland would be cut off. The roads leading east from Grenoble would be in Allied hands, and the remaining German defenders in southern France would face a shrinking corridor of escape. The German commanders understood this with perfect clarity. They also understood that they had very few options. Some German units were attempting to move eastward toward the Alps, hoping to preserve themselves by reaching terrain where the Allies might be unable to follow. Others were attempting to move northward toward Lyon and beyond, hoping to reach defensive positions further up the Rhône Valley, or even to link up with German forces defending the eastern frontier. But all of these movements were increasingly disrupted by the rapid advance of American and French forces coming up behind them. By the 19th of August, American spearheads had advanced to the outskirts of Grenoble itself. The city's German garrison had begun to withdraw, but not before setting fires and preparing demolitions designed to slow the Allied advance. Yet the destruction was less complete than German commanders had hoped. Much of Grenoble's infrastructure remained intact, preserved partly by the speed of the American advance and partly by French resistance fighters who had sabotaged German demolition teams from within the city. When American troops entered Grenoble on the 21st of August, they found a city that was chaotic but salvageable. French civilians poured into the streets. Many were armed with rifles or pistols acquired during the occupation, weapons that had been hidden for years in preparation for exactly this moment of liberation. The scenes were extraordinary and emotional. Ordinary people, shopkeepers and grandmothers and young men who had watched the war pass them by, now marching with the American soldiers, celebrating the end of the occupation that had defined their adult lives. For the Americans, it was a reminder of why they had come to France, not merely to defeat an enemy in battle, but to free a people from oppression. The moment was brief, because the war was not over, but it burned into memory nonetheless. The fall of Grenoble had consequences that rippled across the entire German position in southern France. German forces that had been attempting to retreat eastward found the mountain passes controlled by Allied troops or by French resistance fighters inspired by the liberation of Grenoble. German forces attempting to move north toward Lyon discovered that American columns were already probing in that direction, cutting roads and disrupting supplies. The German army was no longer conducting an organized retreat. It was fragmenting. Units that had been operating as cohesive formations were breaking apart. Soldiers were surrendering in increasing numbers, sometimes in groups of hundreds, sometimes with relief, sometimes with the grim resignation of men who recognized that further resistance was pointless. The German High Command issued orders demanding that troops hold their positions and defend to the last man. But the orders rang hollow. Men in the field understood the reality better than distant generals in Berlin. There was no defensive line to hold, no position that could be held against an enemy that possessed vastly superior numbers, air superiority, and initiative. The only rational choice was to escape if escape was still possible. Lyon, the second largest city in France and the gateway to the Rhone Valley from the north, fell to Allied forces on the 3rd of September 1944. By this point, the German retreat had become a rout. Organized German units were rare. Most German soldiers remaining in southern France were either already captured, already dead, or engaged in desperate individual and small unit movements northward, hoping to reach the German border. The approaches to Lyon were clogged with abandoned equipment, trucks, artillery pieces, tanks damaged beyond easy repair and left behind because there was no fuel or no time to move them. German soldiers lay dead or wounded along the roads. In some areas, the stench of death was overwhelming. French civilians emerged to greet the Allies not with the overwhelming enthusiasm that had greeted them in smaller towns. There was less time, more chaos, more awareness of the ongoing danger, but with profound relief. The occupation, which had lasted for more than 4 years, was ending. The hated symbols of Nazi control that had dominated French cities were coming down. Photographs of Hitler and posters demanding loyalty to the Reich were being torn from walls and burned in the streets. For many French people, the liberation of Lyon marked the true beginning of the end of the Nazi occupation. The German defenders in southern France were not entirely passive throughout this disaster. Desperate counterattacks were launched. German units attempted to hold certain road junctions and towns to buy time for comrades attempting to escape. In numerous places, fighting continued with intensity, even as the broader situation became hopeless. German soldiers, many of them young men with little combat experience and no expectation that they would survive the war, fought with courage and competence in their final stands. But courage and competence could not overcome the fundamental reality. They were outnumbered, outgunned, unsupported by air cover, and facing an enemy that had complete initiative. Each German stand delayed the Allies for a few hours at most, and then collapsed, as American and French forces simply moved around the resistance through the countryside, encircling isolated German garrisons and forcing them to surrender or be annihilated. The cumulative effect was a German defeat that was not merely tactical, but strategic and complete. In less than 3 weeks from the landing beaches, the German position in southern France had transitioned from organized defense to desperate flight to total collapse. The French civilian experience of this rapid advance and liberation varied dramatically depending on location and circumstance. In some towns, liberation came suddenly. American tanks appearing on a main street, German soldiers gone or surrendering, and the French population emerging cautiously to greet their liberators with cautious joy. In other places, especially larger cities, fighting had been fierce enough to damage buildings and cause civilian casualties. The scars of occupation were visible everywhere. Years of requisitions had left the French economy depleted. Stored resources had been seized by the Germans, and infrastructure had been neglected or deliberately damaged during the occupation. Yet, the overwhelming emotion was one of profound relief and hope. Families that had been separated, men conscripted into labor service in Germany, women and children left behind in occupied towns, now dared to imagine reunion. Political prisoners and forced laborers began to be discovered in camps and prisons, and their liberation was a moment of profound emotional weight. The French flag, which had been hidden away for years in cellars and attics, reappeared on buildings and streets. The Marseillaise, the French national anthem, was sung openly and without fear. These moments of cultural rebirth, scattered across towns and cities throughout southern France, represented something far more significant than mere military victory. They represented the restoration of a people's capacity to determine their own future. The German High Command watched this catastrophe unfold with mounting horror and incomprehension. Hitler's response was characteristically both grandiose and detached from reality. Orders came from Berlin demanding that certain cities be held as fortresses, that certain lines be defended to the last soldier, that the lost territory be retaken through massive counteroffensive. None of these orders were remotely feasible. The German commanders in the field understood the true situation better than their superiors in Berlin. There were no reserves available for counteroffensive. There was no possibility of holding elaborate defensive lines. There was only the grim necessity of saving whatever forces could be saved from total annihilation. Some German officers attempted to comply with impossible orders and were killed or captured as a result. Others made the decision to prioritize the survival of their units and began organizing orderly withdrawals, trying to move their troops northward in formations that retained some military cohesion. The best German formations succeeded in this effort. They were able to exit southern France and reach positions where they could continue to fight. Weaker formations, and those commanded by officers who attempted strict compliance with Berlin's orders, were shattered. The failure was not a failure of individual combat units or small unit tactics. It was a failure of German strategy, German intelligence, and German command coordination at the highest levels. By the end of August, the last major German strongpoints in southern France were either falling or already in Allied hands. The rapid advance continued northward, and the focus of the campaign shifted to the pursuit of retreating German forces and to the logistics of maintaining an advance that had moved faster than military planners had anticipated. The Allies were no longer fighting to capture southern France. Southern France was already lost to the Germans. The Allies were fighting to encircle and destroy the German forces that remained. Every day that passed without total German destruction represented a strategic failure in terms of the broader campaign to defeat Nazi Germany. German soldiers that escaped northward might eventually appear on other fronts, defending the Rhine, holding positions in Germany itself. German units that were destroyed in the Rhone Valley could never be reconstituted. The stakes of the race northward were therefore not merely the liberation of additional French territory. The stakes were the complete destruction of German military forces and the prevention of any possibility that Germany might mount an effective defense of its own frontier. This understanding drove the Allied commanders forward with relentless pressure, even as supply lines grew longer and exhaustion mounted among troops who had been fighting continuously since the 15th of August. The race to Grenoble and beyond represented the moment when Operation Dragoon transformed from an invasion into a rout. The beaches had been the test of the Allies' ability to land forces under fire. The subsequent advance was the test of their ability to exploit the landing and to destroy the enemy's ability to wage war. By the measures of both tests, the operation had been a stunning success. The casualty lists reflected the violence of the fighting, but they also reflected that the Allies had achieved their objectives at a cost that was acceptable by the standards of modern warfare. The Germans had paid a far higher price: thousands killed, tens of thousands captured, equipment and supplies abandoned in enormous quantities. The two jaws of the Allied vise, Eisenhower's armies from Normandy and Patch's forces from the Mediterranean, were moving relentlessly toward one another, and the German army caught between them was being methodically crushed. The race to Grenoble was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of the end, and for the people of southern France, it was the beginning of their journey back to freedom. By the end of the first week of August, the strategic situation for Nazi Germany had transformed from uncertainty into catastrophe. Two massive Allied armies were now converging on France from opposite directions, and the German commanders trapped between them faced a choice that no military officer wishes to confront. orderly retreat toward defensive positions, or encirclement and destruction. The northern jaw came from Normandy, where Eisenhower's forces had broken out of the bocage and were driving south with gathering momentum. The southern jaw advanced northward from the Mediterranean beaches, pushing through towns and valleys with relentless speed. Between these two advancing forces lay hundreds of thousands of German troops, supply lines, and equipment that had been stationed throughout France since the occupation began 4 years earlier. For the Wehrmacht officers commanding these units, the mathematics of their situation had become brutally clear. They could no longer defend France itself. Their only hope lay in extricating as many troops and as much material as possible before the two Allied pincers closed completely. The German High Command in Berlin had anticipated encirclement as a theoretical possibility, but Hitler's strategic paralysis prevented coherent action until the trap was nearly closed. The Führer's orders from his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair came filtered through multiple layers of command, often contradictory, and always governed by ideological obstinacy rather than operational reality. General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding German Army Group G in southern France, recognized the peril immediately but found his appeals for permission to withdraw falling on deaf ears in Berlin. Meanwhile, General Otto Dessloch, commanding the Luftwaffe forces in the region, reported daily that his air assets were insufficient to slow the Allied advance or protect German columns from air attack. The Wehrmacht lacked the fuel for rapid movement, the ammunition for sustained defensive operations, and the manpower to form a coherent fighting line across the widening gap between the two Allied forces. What had worked for the Germans in earlier campaigns, rapid concentration of force, exploitation of interior lines, counterattack, became impossible when the enemy controlled the skies and outnumbered ground forces 2-1. German officers watched the noose tighten with the grim knowledge that their superiors in Berlin would accept no retreat without explicit orders, and those orders would arrive, if they came at all, too late. The German 19th Army, under General Friedrich Wieser, bore the primary burden of this catastrophic situation. Stationed originally along the Mediterranean coast to repel the invasion that the Allies were now executing, the 19th Army had been gradually pushed back toward the interior of France during the first 2 weeks of August. Wiese commanded roughly 180,000 men, but they were scattered across a vast territory, many cut off from supply lines, and many without clear orders as to where they should establish a new defensive line. The Wehrmacht divisions under his command had suffered sustained losses during the beachhead fighting and had not yet fully regrouped when the Allies broke out of their initial lodgement areas. To the west, the First Army under General Paul Hauser was attempting to hold a line against the northward advancing forces from Normandy, but this line was fractured in multiple places and collapsing under coordinated assaults. The gap between Wieser's and Hauser's commands grew wider each day as Allied armour and mechanized infantry drove through the countryside, cutting roads, destroying ammunition dumps, and isolating German units into pockets that could not be easily reinforced or resupplied. German officers sent urgent requests for reinforcements to Paris, only to learn that no reinforcements were available and that Paris itself was now threatened by advancing Allied columns. By the second week of August, the reality of encirclement had become undeniable even to the most optimistic German staff officers. The Allies had achieved a speed of advance that exceeded German expectations, pushing nearly 100 kilometers inland in some sectors and threatening to close the trap entirely before organized German forces could disengage. The town of Falaise, located in Normandy and far to the north, became the symbol of this developing catastrophe. Canadian, British, and Polish forces were converging on the town from multiple directions, attempting to seal off a massive pocket that contained thousands of German troops and vehicles. General Wiese ordered his forces to begin withdrawing northward toward the Loire River, hoping to establish defensive positions there. But the roads northward were congested with retreating columns, blocked by air attack, and increasingly cut off by advanced Allied patrols. The logistics system that had supported German armies across France for 4 years simply disintegrated under the pressure of simultaneous retreat, combat, and air attack. Trucks were abandoned when fuel ran out. Ammunition was destroyed rather than carried. Officers made heartbreaking decisions about which units would stay behind to cover the retreat, and which would attempt to break through Allied lines. These rearguard formations knew they were being sacrificed to buy time for the main army, and many were surrounded and captured within days. The Falaise pocket itself became the focal point of German desperation during the middle of August. As Canadian forces pushed south from Normandy and American forces pushed north from the Normandy breakout area, they threatened to close a massive encirclement that contained an estimated 50,000 to 100,000 German troops. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American forces from the south, made the controversial decision not to advance beyond the town of Argentan, ordering his troops to hold their position and allow the northern forces to complete the encirclement. The reasoning was sound from a tactical perspective. A too rapid American advance might result in friendly fire incidents with Canadian and Polish forces closing from the north, and a slower encirclement would allow more German troops to be trapped. But the delay also allowed a gap to remain open through which German forces poured northward in desperate columns. German commanders, seeing the gap, threw everything they had at the escaping routes, using artillery and limited air support to drive their forces through in days that saw some of the war's most brutal and chaotic scenes. American and Canadian forces hammered the retreating columns with artillery and airstrikes, turning roads into corridors of destruction where burning vehicles blocked the way and dead men and animals lay scattered across the pavement. The Germans called this period the Kesselschlacht, the Cauldron Battle, and it consumed their reserves of trained soldiers that could not be replaced. Escape from the pocket was not merely a matter of surviving combat. It was a matter of navigating a landscape that had been transformed into an apocalyptic wasteland. Roads were jammed with retreating columns moving in multiple directions at once, some units attempting to break through Allied lines, others trying to link up with units that had already broken free, and still others simply trying to reach whatever defensive position might exist ahead. German soldiers ran low on ammunition, fuel, water, and food as supply lines were cut. Horses, still the primary means of transport for German artillery, and many support units, were driven to exhaustion and then slaughtered for meat when they could no longer move. Desertion increased as isolated soldiers, separated from their units, and seeing the hopelessness of the situation, simply walked away from the war. Military police tried to maintain discipline, but their authority meant little to men who had concluded that Germany was defeated. The Luftwaffe made occasional appearances, but Allied fighters dominated the skies, and any German aircraft that attempted to cover the retreat was quickly shot down. German soldiers who survived this retreat would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. The smell of burning fuel and rotting animals, the sight of comrades blown apart by artillery fire, the howling of dive bombers descending on their columns, and the grinding realization that the war was already lost. The collapse of German resistance accelerated during the final days of August as the pocket contracted and more units found themselves surrounded. Some formations attempted to break through Allied lines in coordinated attacks, throwing their remaining armor and infantry at the American and Canadian positions, hoping to punch through to safety. These attacks met with furious resistance, and the Germans suffered catastrophic losses without achieving their objectives. Other units, recognizing that escape was impossible, simply stacked their weapons and surrendered to the nearest Allied soldier or officer. German prisoners of war began arriving at Allied prisoner collection points in such numbers that the logistics of processing them became overwhelming. American and British soldiers, hardened by months of combat, nevertheless were sometimes shocked by the condition of these prisoners. Many were teenagers who had been conscripted in the final years of the war. Some were wounded, many were half-starved, and most were simply shell-shocked by the intensity of their defeat. The prisoners were loaded into trucks and transported to rear areas where they would spend the remainder of the war and several years afterward in prisoner camps. The discipline and organization that had characterized the Wehrmacht at the beginning of the war had disintegrated completely. Stragglers roamed the countryside, sometimes surrendering to French civilians or resistance fighters who had emerged to participate in the final stages of the campaign. The German 19th Army effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force by the end of the third week of August. General Wyss managed to withdraw roughly half of his original force, perhaps 80 to 90,000 men, out of the encircling pocket, but the cost in lost equipment, vehicles and supplies was catastrophic. Artillery pieces that had been emplaced in fortifications along the coast were abandoned because there was no fuel to move them and no horses to pull them. Trucks and staff cars were destroyed to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. Ammunition dumps that could not be transported were blown up. The Germans lost more equipment in the pocket than many nations possessed in their entire armed forces. The retreat became a race against time as units tried to reach the Loire River before the Allies could cut them off again. French resistance fighters ambushed columns on country roads, harassing stragglers and destroying isolated vehicles. The world of southern France, which had been occupied peacefully for 4 years, became a war zone where the defeated German army was being ground to pieces by pursuing Allied forces. The psychological impact of the Falaise pocket and the collapse of German forces in the south reverberated through the remaining German command structure with terrible clarity. Officers who had served in the east, where the Wehrmacht had been driven back across vast territories, recognized that a similar pattern was repeating itself in France. Steady retreat, encirclement, loss of equipment and personnel that could not be replaced, and the gradual attrition of combat strength until nothing remained. The German army had lost roughly 200,000 men in the Normandy campaign and the subsequent pocket battles by the end of August. These were not merely casualties. Many were dead, captured, or permanently disabled, and they represented a loss of experienced soldiers whose training and combat knowledge took years to develop. The Wehrmacht could no longer replace these losses at anything approaching the same level of training and experience. The army was being forced to strip units from other theaters and improvise new formations from miscellaneous detachments, which reduced overall effectiveness across the entire German military. Officers wrote in their diaries and official reports of their conviction that the war was unwinnable, that Germany would be defeated, and that continued fighting only prolonged the suffering of the German people. But these conclusions remained private, because openly expressing such thoughts was treason under Nazi law, and many senior officers had already been executed or relieved of command for far less. The closing of the Falaise pocket and the subsequent destruction of German forces in southern France represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the war. The Wehrmacht was no longer capable of conducting major offensive operations anywhere in Europe. The German army in France was shattered and would spend the remainder of the war in continuous retreat toward Germany itself. The Allies, by contrast, had demonstrated their ability to conduct major amphibious operations, coordinate multiple armies across vast distances, and pursue defeated enemies with relentless pressure. The encirclement that had trapped German forces in the pocket became a model for subsequent operations as the Allies advanced across France toward Germany. German troops who escaped the pocket and retreated toward the German border were not, in most cases, able to establish new defensive lines that would halt the Allied advance. The German army lacked the reserves to strengthen these lines, lacked the fuel to move units rapidly to threatened sectors, and lacked the air support necessary to disrupt Allied movements. What remained of German strength in France was essentially disorganized retreat, and the retreating forces were harassed at every step by Allied mechanized units and air power. The scenes of destruction in the wake of the collapsing pocket revealed the scale of the military catastrophe that had befallen Germany. Fields were covered with burned-out vehicles, destroyed artillery pieces, and abandoned equipment. Roads were littered with the debris of retreat: helmets, weapons, ammunition boxes, letters from home, photographs. Tens of thousands of German soldiers had become prisoners of war, and the process of moving, feeding, and securing these prisoners consumed enormous Allied resources. Refugees fleeted the war zones, often encountering both German forces still in retreat and Allied forces advancing northward, creating scenes of human misery and confusion in towns and villages across France. The German occupation of France, which had lasted for more than 4 years, was ending not with negotiated withdrawal or defensive success, but with catastrophic military defeat and the dissolution of organized authority. The German army that had conquered France in 1940 could no longer defend it, could no longer control it, and would soon be driven entirely out of it. For German soldiers still fighting, the recognition that they had become an army of the defeated, an army in retreat with no prospect of stopping the enemy advance, transformed their daily experience of combat from defensive duty into something closer to desperate survival. The pocket was not merely a military disaster, it was the visible, undeniable proof that Germany had lost the war, and that acknowledgement, terrifying as it was, spread through the German military like a contagion against which no order from Berlin could inoculate the troops. By the first days of September, the German forces that had held southern France had been effectively destroyed as an organized military entity. The survivors were streaming northward toward defensive positions that did not yet exist, following the Loire River and hoping to establish a new line somewhere in central France. But the Allies were pursuing them with such speed and force that even this hope seemed fragile and temporary. German commanders understood that the war was moving now into its final phases, that Germany itself was threatened with invasion, and that the Wehrmacht would henceforth be fighting to defend its own homeland rather than to preserve any of the conquests it had made in the years of Nazi expansion. The Falaise pocket and the destruction of German forces in southern France had not ended the war, but they had ended any German hope of negotiated settlement or stabilization of the front. The trap that had been set for German forces between the two invading armies had sprung with devastating effect, and those who escaped did so knowing that other traps would follow, that other pockets would form, and that the only direction left for Germany to go was backward, into defeat and occupation. The beaches of southern France were barely secure when the Allies shifted their gaze inland toward the great cities that had endured 4 years of German occupation: Marseille, Toulon, Lyon, These were not mere geographic objectives on a military map. They were living centers of human hope, places where French civilians had suffered under Nazi rule, where political prisoners rotted in dungeons, where forced laborers had been worked to exhaustion in factories and ports. The rapid advance inland after the 15th of August transformed the campaign from a beachhead struggle into a race through French cities where combat would be personal, urban, and psychologically charged. The Germans, realizing that encirclement was closing around them, did not simply abandon these places. They fortified them, garrisoned them with determined troops, and in some cases chose to fight for every street and building rather than surrender ground. For the Allies, the liberation of these cities meant brutal street fighting, coordination with local French resistance forces who had waited years for this moment, and the profound emotional weight of freeing enslaved populations from oppression. Marseille, France's great Mediterranean port, presented the most formidable urban challenge. The city sprawled across steep hills and dense quarters, with a harbour bristling with German defensive positions. The port itself had been a crucial supply line for Nazi occupation forces throughout the Mediterranean, making it both strategically vital and heavily defended. By the time American and Free French units approached Marseille in the latter half of August, the German garrison commander understood that holding the city was likely impossible, yet orders from higher command demanded that he contest the ground. French resistance fighters, known as the Maquis, had already been harassing German supply lines and communications around the city for days, operating from the surrounding hills and urban hideouts. They had waited through the long years of occupation for this moment, when they could emerge from clandestinity and strike openly against the occupiers. As the Allies advanced, the resistance fighters grew bolder, establishing roadblocks, ambushing German convoys, and preventing reinforcement of the garrison. The Germans responded with sweeping patrols and arrests, but the apparatus of occupation was fraying. The city's civilian population, drawn to windows and rooftops as they heard the sounds of approaching liberation, waited with a tension that mixed hope and fear. The final assault on Marseille began around the 21st of August, when American and Free French forces launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The Germans had concentrated their strength in several strongpoints: the harbour district, the Old Town, and key defensive positions on the surrounding hills. Artillery pounded these positions in the pre-dawn darkness, and as dawn broke, Allied infantry advanced through residential streets under fire. Snipers took positions in buildings, slowing the Allied advance and inflicting casualties that mounted block by block. The street-by-street fighting that followed was methodical and costly, with soldiers clearing buildings room by room, never knowing whether the next doorway held armed Germans or terrified civilians. French resistance fighters, now operating openly alongside the regular Allied forces, used their intimate knowledge of Marseille's maze-like streets to guide troops through the most efficient routes and to negotiate surrenders with German units who recognized that further resistance was futile. The Germans, low on ammunition and cut off from resupply, began to deteriorate as a cohesive fighting force. By the 28th of August, after 1 week of urban combat, the German commander raised the white flag. Thousands of German soldiers, hollow-eyed and exhausted, emerged from bunkers and fortified positions to surrender. The port of Marseille, so long a German asset, fell into Allied hands, with its facilities largely intact, providing a crucial new supply artery for the advancing armies. Toulon, the French naval base 40 kilometers east of Marseille, presented similar challenges, but with a slightly different character. The Germans had transformed Toulon into a fortress, with concrete anti-tank obstacles, barbed wire entanglements, and coastal artillery positions that could still threaten the Mediterranean approaches. The city had been a major French naval installation before the war, and the Germans had used it extensively as a naval base and arsenal throughout their occupation. French sailors and naval personnel who had been forced to serve under German command during the occupation now had the chance to reclaim their city. As American and Free French forces approached Toulon from multiple directions, they found the Germans more prepared to fight than at Marseille. The fortress mentality was stronger, and the German garrison commander, unlike his counterpart at Marseille, seemed willing to make a last stand. The fighting around Toulon's outer defences began in earnest around the 18th of August and continued with relentless intensity. French resistance units, coordinating with the advancing American forces, launched attacks on German ammunition depots and fuel supplies in the surrounding countryside, starving the defense of critical resources. By the 26th of August, as supplies dwindled and the Germans faced the inevitable prospect of complete encirclement, they began to surrender. The liberation of Toulon, like Marseille, came with the elation of freed prisoners emerging into daylight, of forced labourers realizing that their ordeal was ending, of French civilians who could finally walk streets without fear of German patrols. Lyon, the second city of France, lay deep inland in the Rhône Valley, roughly 180 kilometers north of the beachheads. The Allies' race to capture Lyon became one of the most rapid advances of the entire campaign, driven by the need to cut off German forces fleeing northward and by the strategic importance of securing this major city and road junction before German reinforcements could arrive. Lyon had been a center of French resistance throughout the occupation, with underground networks operating in the city itself and in the surrounding countryside. The German garrison commander in Lyon, receiving orders to hold the city to the last man, was also receiving contradictory messages from higher command. Some orders demanding a fight to the death, others suggesting that holding Lyon was impossible and that withdrawal should be considered. This confusion in the German chain of command, compounded by the rapid approach of American forces from the south and the threat of being surrounded, led to hesitation and then collapse. The Allies, understanding that speed was essential, pushed their mobile columns northward with extraordinary velocity, covering vast distances in single days. French resistance fighters in and around Lyon harassed German columns, cut supply lines, and in some cases convinced German units that further resistance was pointless. By the 3rd of September, American forces entered Lyon from the south, encountering only scattered German resistance. The city fell to the Allies in a matter of hours rather than days, a stunning conclusion to the rapid advance that had characterized Operation Dragoon's inland campaign. Across these cities and throughout the territories liberated during Operation Dragoon, a profound and often overwhelming human drama unfolded. Political prisoners, men and women who had been imprisoned for their resistance to Nazi rule, were released from jails and concentration camps. Some had been held for years, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and abuse, their minds marked by the trauma of captivity. Former forced laborers, conscripted during the occupation to work in factories, ports, and mines, found themselves suddenly freed. Italian prisoners of war, captured by the Germans after Italy's surrender and held in camps in southern France, walked out through open gates and into the hands of Allied forces. The emotional impact on the French civilian population was immeasurable. Families who had been separated by the occupation were reunited. French soldiers who had fled during the collapse of 1940 and had spent 4 years in exile could now return to their homes. Flags that had been hidden for years emerged and were hung from windows and buildings, Church bells, silent under occupation, rang out to celebrate liberation. The streets filled with people embracing soldiers, pressing flowers and wine into their hands, weeping with joy and relief. The urban fighting in these cities also created immense destruction and civilian casualties. Artillery bombardments damaged buildings and infrastructure. Urban combat in dense residential neighborhoods meant that civilians were often caught in crossfire or trapped in their homes during the heaviest fighting. Some buildings were destroyed, some burned, some collapsed under the weight of artillery fire. Civilian casualties, though far fewer than they would have been had the Germans fought with the fanaticism they sometimes displayed elsewhere, were nonetheless tragic and deeply felt. The Allies, understanding the political importance of minimizing civilian deaths, tried to concentrate their firepower on identified German positions, but urban warfare inherently endangers non-combatants. After the fighting ended, the streets were often chaotic, water mains broken, electricity cut off, food supplies disrupted, the basic infrastructure of urban life in disarray. Yet underneath this chaos was a profound sense of liberation, a feeling that despite the destruction and hardship, the occupation had ended. French civil authorities began to reassert themselves, albeit under Allied military oversight. The provisional government of the French Republic, headed by Charles de Gaulle, moved to establish control over liberated territories. French soldiers, many of them who had joined Free French forces during the long exile, now marched through the streets of their own cities in triumph. The role of the French resistance in the liberation of southern French cities cannot be overstated. These were men and women who had operated in clandestinity for 4 years, running safe houses, gathering intelligence, organizing sabotage operations, and maintaining their commitment to French sovereignty despite the overwhelming power of Nazi occupation. As the invasion began, they emerged from hiding and took up arms openly for the first time. They served as guides for advancing Allied forces, sharing intimate knowledge of terrain, defensive positions, and German deployments that had been gathered through months of careful observation. They blocked escape routes, preventing German units from withdrawing northward to reinforce other sectors. In some cases, they negotiated the surrender of German garrisons, convincing isolated and exhausted troops that resistance was futile. In other cases, they fought alongside Allied soldiers in street-by-street combat, sometimes sustaining casualties that reflected their lack of formal military training. The resistance units, though organized into larger structures by late August, were still often ad hoc groups led by men and women whose only qualification was courage and determination. Their presence in the liberation of southern French cities carried profound symbolic weight. This was France liberating itself, with Allied support, rather than being liberated entirely from outside. The psychological impact of the fall of southern cities reverberated far beyond the immediate military campaign. In Marseille, the sight of the German swastika being hauled down from public buildings and replaced with the French tricolour represented the beginning of the end for Nazi occupation. In Toulon, the reoccupation of the French naval base meant that France's Mediterranean presence, stripped away in 1940,